Dr. Clara Vance had just finished a grueling 8-hour neurosurgery. Walking out of the operating room, she pulled off her surgical mask, revealing a face that was slightly exhausted but profoundly calm. The harsh fluorescent lights of the corridor spilled over her pristine white lab coat, making her look both sterile and unapproachable. Returning to her private office, she unscrewed her insulated travel mug and took a sip of warm water. Her smartphone lay completely silent on her mahogany desk. There were no missed calls and no unread text messages. This was perfect. Clara cherished this absolute silence. It was a peace she had spent 10 grueling years earning for herself. A knock sounded at her office door. It was light, yet laced with an arrogant, unyielding stubbornness. Clara said, "Come in." The door pushed open. A middle-aged man in a bespoke tailored suit walked in. His hair was perfectly styled without a single strand out of place. A ridiculously expensive Patek Philippe watch gleamed on his wrist, and the years had left distinguished lines on his face. However, that familiar, condescending aura had not changed in the slightest. It was Richard Vance, her father, a man she had not seen in 10 years. Clara's eyes did not ripple with a single emotion. She did not even bother to stand up. She simply looked at him in silence, as if observing a complete stranger. Richard was visibly displeased by her coldness. He knitted his brows, pulled out a chair without asking, and sat directly across from her. "I have been looking all over for you," he said, his tone carrying the patronizing familiarity of someone bestowing a favor. Clara did not respond. She picked up her mug and gently blew on the steam. Richard's gaze swept across the office. It was spacious and bright, the floor-to-ceiling windows framing the most prosperous skyline of Manhattan. The walls were adorned with various medical board certifications, Ivy League degrees, and prestigious awards. A complex flash of emotion crossed his eyes, surprise, scrutiny, but mostly a sense of entitlement, as if her brilliant success was somehow his own glory. "You are doing quite well for yourself," he evaluated. Clara set her mug down, her voice flat. "Is there a reason you are here?" Richard cleared his throat and finally stated his purpose. "It is about your brother." Clara did not even blink. "I do not have a brother." Richard's face darkened. "Clara, that is your blood brother, Julian Vance. You have the exact same blood running through your veins." Clara laughed, a very light, ice-cold sound. "My mother only gave birth to me." "Richard, your son is the child you had with your current wife. What does he have to do with me?" Richard choked on his words. He never expected that the quiet, submissive daughter from a decade ago would have transformed into someone so sharp and articulate. He took a deep breath, suppressing his temper. Julian's MCAT scores this year were less than ideal, and he wants to go to medical school. You know how impossible the cutoff scores are for top programs. Clara looked at him as if watching a terribly written off-Broadway play. "And your point is?" Richard leaned forward, his tone turning absolute. "You are the youngest attending surgeon at this hospital, a renowned specialist in the field. You definitely have connections and leverage. I need you to make a call to the admissions board at your alma mater and get Julian a spot." He spoke with such breezy ease, as if orchestrating admission into a premier medical school was as simple as ordering a cup of coffee. Clara finally looked him dead in the eye, her gaze as surgical and freezing as a scalpel. "Mr. Vance, do you have a fundamental misunderstanding of the medical profession? Or perhaps a fundamental misunderstanding of federal law?" Richard's face flushed a deep, angry red. "What does the law have to do with this? We are a family. Families are supposed to help each other. You are his older sister. Helping him is your absolute duty." "Duty," Clara repeated the word in her mind, finding it incredibly ironic. "When I took my high school entrance exams with a 102-degree fever, navigating the subway all by myself, where were you? When I was filling out my college applications, having no idea who to ask for advice, I called you. You told me you were busy taking Julian to Disney World and had no time. Why didn't you mention absolute duty back then?" Having ancient history thrown back in his face made Richard visibly uncomfortable. He argued in a gruff voice. "Wasn't I busy working? You were old enough. Couldn't you handle a minor thing like that yourself?" "Yes," Clara nodded. "I could handle it. That is exactly why I got into pre-med by myself, survived 4 years of medical school, conquered an endless residency, and fought my way up in this hospital for another 5 years. I handled every single bit of that by myself." She looked at Richard, articulating every single syllable with razor-sharp clarity. "Now your son wants to study medicine, so please have him handle it himself. Medical school admissions are standardized for a reason. If he has the brains, he can earn his way in. If he does not, he can go do whatever else he is actually qualified for. Richard slammed his hand on the desk and shot up from his chair. You are out of line, Clara. I brought you into this world, and this is how you speak to me? Clara stood up as well. She was roughly the same height as Richard, but her presence completely crushed his. Brought me into this world? You contributed a single sperm. Raised me? Did you ever pay a single dime of court-ordered child support? When I was 12 and you married Eleanor, you had already thrown me away like useless baggage. Now that this baggage has some utility, you suddenly remember I exist. Richard, the world does not run on your convenience. Richard was trembling with rage, pointing a shaking finger at her face. You ungrateful wretch! Clara picked up the receiver of her landline. My office hours are over. If you do not leave right now, I am calling hospital security. Richard looked into her dead, freezing eyes and knew she was not bluffing. He threw his hand down in a vicious gesture, turned, and marched toward the door. At the threshold, unwilling to accept defeat, he looked back. You will regret this, Clara. I am your father. You can never get rid of me. The door slammed shut with a violent bang, and absolute quiet returned to the office. Clara sat back down, picked up the now lukewarm water, and took a slow sip. Regret? Her only regret in this lifetime was ever holding on to a shred of foolish hope for these people. The day after Richard Vance departed, Clara received a phone call from her mother, Martha Higgins. The moment the call connected, Clara could vividly picture Martha's face, plastered with a sycophantic, fawning smile. Clara, sweetie, are you busy? Clara gave a faint hum of acknowledgement. Martha's voice grew excessively affectionate. Oh, my daughter is just so capable. A top surgeon at such a young age. Mom is so incredibly proud of you. Clara remained silent. She couldn't be bothered to offer even a punctuation mark in response to this entirely hollow flattery. Martha rambled through a few more lines of one-sided small talk before finally getting to the point. Clara, honey, there is a little favor I need to ask of you. Here it is, Clara thought. Another favor. These people only remembered they had a daughter when they needed something extracted from her. Your stepdad Gary hasn't been feeling well lately. Martha was referring to her second husband, Gary Higgins. He keeps coughing, and his chest feels terribly tight. We went to the urgent care clinic, but they couldn't figure out what was wrong. You work at that massive research hospital, right? Could you arrange for him to be admitted into a private suite so they can run some proper tests? Martha's tone brimmed with expectation, as if Clara only needed to snap her fingers, and an empty luxury hospital bed would magically materialize for Gary. Clara's voice revealed zero emotion. What are his exact symptoms? Does he have previous diagnostic reports, like chest x-rays or a CT scan? She was using her clinical doctor's voice professional, detached, completely devoid of any personal sentiment. Martha was momentarily stunned, clearly not expecting such a detailed interrogation. Oh, how am I supposed to understand all that medical jargon? I'm just asking you to get him a bed. Once he's admitted, won't your hospital doctors just test everything anyway? Clara leaned back in her ergonomic chair. Hospital beds are strictly regulated, especially in our neurology and cardiology wings. All patients must adhere to standard protocols. If it is a medical emergency, you need to take him to the emergency room. If it is a non-emergency, he needs to get a referral from his primary care physician and book an outpatient consultation. A doctor will evaluate if inpatient admission is medically necessary, and then he will go on the wait list for a bed. Martha's pitch immediately skyrocketed. Wait on a list? How long will that take? You are a top doctor there. Can't you just tell the people in your department to bypass it? Other people wait in line, but we are family. How can you treat us like everyone else? Family. Clara repeated the word softly. Mrs. Higgins, exactly when did we become family? On the other end of the line, Martha choked on the words, You, how can you speak to me like that? I am your mother. Clara's response was precise and devastating. When I was in college, my basic living expenses required $600 a month. You deposited $150 into my account. When I called you to tell you I could not afford to eat, what did you say? You said household expenses were tight, that your new son needed things, and asked why a grown girl like me couldn't just be more frugal. You told me my father was rich, that I should go bother him and stop annoying you. Why didn't you mention we were family back then? Martha's breathing turned ragged and rapid. Why? Why are you dragging up ancient history? Things were hard for me back then too. Gary didn't make much money, and I had to take care of your brother Derek. Besides, I raised you. I put food in your mouth and clothes on your back. Is that not enough? Clara found it laughable. Raising me until I was 12 was the legal obligation of you and Richard Vance. After I turned 12, you sent me $150 a month until I turned 18. That is 72 months. The grand total comes to exactly $10,800. I will double that amount and pay it back to you when you are in a nursing home. As for the hospital admission. Clara paused, her voice turning to pure ice. Everyone is treated equally. Get a referral and wait in line. That is hospital policy. Martha shrieked through the receiver. Clara Vance, do you have no conscience at all? If something terrible happens to Gary, I will never forgive you. Have you forgotten how nice he was to you when you were little? He even bought you a brand new backpack for school. It cost $50. Clara remembered it perfectly. Because of that $50 backpack, Gary Higgins had relentlessly held it over her head for 3 entire years. Every single time she came back from begging Richard for her meager living allowance, Gary would make some passive-aggressive comment. Look who's back with cash. Don't forget your stepdad bought you a backpack. Clara spoke with flat tranquility. I will add the $50 for the backpack to the $10,800 next time. Martha was so furious she lost the ability to speak. Clara had no desire to waste another second. If there is nothing else, I am hanging up. I have a busy schedule. Without waiting, she terminated the call. The world was peaceful once more. Clara massaged her temples, fully aware that this ordeal would not end so easily. Richard and Martha were cut from the exact same cloth, selfish, greedy, and entirely incapable of self-reflection. When rejected, their only default setting was to fly into a humiliated rage and resort to extreme measures to get their way. Sure enough, a little while later, her phone rang again. It was an unknown number. Clara swiped to answer. An arrogant, youthful male voice blared through the speaker. Is this Clara? Clara did not answer. It's Derek. You remember me, right? Derek Higgins, the son of Martha and Gary, Clara's second so-called brother. I am warning you. If anything happens to my dad, you are the first person I am coming after. Don't think just because you're some hotshot doctor you're untouchable. My mom was right. You're nothing but a cold-blooded sociopath. Clara listened quietly. She waited until he completely ran out of breath before speaking at a leisurely pace. Are you finished? Derek paused, confused. Yeah, I'm finished. What are you going to do about it? My phone line operates on a billable recording system. Verbal abuse is billed at $500 a minute. You just ranted for exactly 30 seconds. I will round it down to $250. Make sure you Venmo me the money. Before the other party could even process what she said, Clara hung up and instantly blocked the number. She looked out the window. The sky over Manhattan was darkening. A storm was coming. The storm Clara anticipated arrived faster and far more violently than she expected. On the morning of the third day, she was just stepping out of a VIP patient's room when she saw a massive crowd gathered in her department's corridor. A chaotic blend of shouting, arguing, and theatrical wailing pierced the sterile air, grating painfully against her eardrums. Frowning, Clara walked toward the commotion. At the epicenter of the crowd were 2 distinct factions. One consisted of her father Richard, his wife Eleanor, and that supposed half-brother Julian. The other faction was her mother, Martha, her stepdad, Gary, and the foul-mouthed Derek. Today, these 2 entirely separate families, who usually avoided each other like the plague, had miraculously formed a united front. Their shared enemy was Clara. Eleanor was sitting flat on the polished linoleum floor, slapping her thighs, weeping with snot and tears streaming down her face. Where is the justice? A daughter becomes a big-shot doctor and refuses to acknowledge her own parents. She lives in a luxury condo and drives a sports car, but when her own flesh-and-blood father asks a tiny favor for her brother, she turns her back on us. Not to be outdone, Martha pointed at the surrounding patients and families, broadcasting her grievances. Everyone, look at this! This is the famous Dr. Clara Vance. Her own mother's husband falls deathly ill, and we just asked her to get him a bed, but she told us to go wait in line like strangers. She said she isn't family with us. She doesn't even recognize her own mother. Gary leaned weakly against the wall, putting on a highly exaggerated, sickly performance, occasionally coughing violently, as if he were about to draw his last breath. Derek, acting like a rabid pit bull, aggressively pointed his finger at the charge nurse who had rushed over to mediate. What are you looking at? Bring your chief surgeon Clara out here right now and tell her to give us an explanation. Otherwise, we are sleeping right here and never leaving. Richard stood slightly to the side, his face dark and imposing, not uttering a word. He was silently endorsing this circus. In fact, he was clearly one of its chief architects. They intended to weaponize public opinion and moral blackmail to force her into submission. The surrounding patients and families were whispering and pointing. Some faces displayed blatant disgust directed toward Clara's office, clearly buying into the theatrical sob story. The charge nurse was sweating profusely, completely powerless against this mob. Clara parted the crowd and stepped directly in front of them. She was still wearing her white coat, her expression absolute zero, her eyes devoid of a single degree of warmth. "This is a hospital. Keep your voices down." Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise like an ice pick, instantly bringing a chilling quiet to the chaotic scene. Upon seeing her, Martha immediately lunged forward, trying to grab her arm. "You heartless creature. You finally show your face." Clara took a precise step back, easily evading her grasp. Eleanor scrambled up from the floor, pointing a manicured finger right at Clara's nose. "You little brat! You dare hide from us? You must give us a proper explanation today." Clara's gaze swept methodically across every single face in their alliance. Richard's hypocrisy, Eleanor's malice, Martha's hysteria, Gary's feigned illness, and the gleeful schadenfreude dancing in the eyes of Julian and Derek. It truly was a spectacular display of domestic theater. Unfortunately for them, she was not an audience member. She was the intended human sacrifice. An explanation. Clara finally spoke, her voice crisp and indifferent. "What exactly do you want me to explain?" Richard finally broke his silence, assuming the posture of a deeply heartbroken patriarch. "Clara, we do not want to blow this out of proportion. Just nod your head, get Julian's medical school admission sorted out, and arrange a private VIP suite for Gary. We will leave immediately. We are still a family." "Family." Clara smiled. "Mr. Vance, you seem to have forgotten something. Our so-called family shattered into pieces a decade ago." Her gaze shifted to Eleanor, her eyes then locked onto Martha and Gary. "If you want medical treatment, go book an appointment and wait your turn. If you want to cut the line, I apologize, but there are no VIP privileges here. The medical resources of this hospital are reserved for patients who actually need them, not for extortionists throwing tantrums on the floor." Her words struck like a resounding, invisible slap across every single one of their faces. Derek was instantly enraged. He lunged aggressively toward Clara. "Who the hell are you calling an extortionist?" Clara did not flinch or step back. She merely stared at him with freezing detachment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. Everyone assumed she was going to call someone to beg for peace or seek mediation. Instead, Clara looked them dead in the eye and pressed 3 numbers on the hospital's internal speed dial. Her voice was as calm as a placid lake. "Security? This is Dr. Clara Vance from neurosurgery. There is a group of individuals creating a severe disturbance on the 7th floor of the A wing, actively disrupting critical medical operations. One of the male individuals is exhibiting violent, combative behavior. Please dispatch a Code Gray team immediately." She hung up the phone. Dead silence swept the corridor. Richard and Martha were completely paralyzed with shock. They had predicted 10,000 different scenarios that Clara would argue, that she would cry, that she would bow to the public humiliation, but they never once imagined she would bypass all family protocol and summon security. She was treating them exactly like violent hospital trespassers. Richard's face morphed into the color of raw liver. "Clara, you wouldn't dare." Clara looked at him, speaking lightly. "Why wouldn't I? In my eyes, you are no different from the deranged people who riot in the ER because they can't get a prescription. You are breaking hospital rules and endangering sick patients. Dealing with people like you strictly according to protocol is my professional duty." Within 2 minutes, a team of burly, armed hospital security guards charged down the hall, expressions grim and authoritative. "Who is causing a disturbance here?" The charge nurse immediately pointed at Richard's group. Them. The security officers didn't waste a breath. They immediately moved in and formed a tight tactical circle around the families. "You are trespassing. Vacate the premises immediately, or we will deploy physical force and call the NYPD." Derek tried to put up a fight. A massive security guard immediately pinned his arms behind his back, shoving him face first against the wall. Eleanor and Martha shrieked in absolute terror. Gary miraculously dropped his dying man act. His face turned chalk white and he cowered in the back, terrified to make a sound. A grand, theatrical public shaming had been effortlessly neutralized into an embarrassing criminal eviction. Richard was physically escorted out by 2 guards. He twisted his head back, glaring at Clara with a gaze dripping with venom and resentment. "You just wait, Clara. I am going to the hospital board. I will make sure your career is destroyed." Clara watched him get dragged away with a completely expressionless face. The corridor finally returned to its sterile quiet. The surrounding patients and families now looked at Clara, their expressions shifting from initial disgust to deep awe and profound sympathy. The charge nurse walked up, whispering cautiously, "Dr. Vance, are you all right?" Clara shook her head dismissively. "I am perfectly fine." She turned to resume her ward rounds. After taking 2 steps, she paused and looked back at the charge nurse. "Issue a departmental directive. From this moment on, these specific individuals are permanently banned from entering the neurology wing. If they show their faces here again, bypass security and dial 911 directly." The charge nurse nodded vigorously. "Understood, Dr. Vance." Clara's silhouette looked exceptionally straight and tall as she walked down the long corridor, yet simultaneously, deeply solitary. The hospital spectacle ended with Richard's gang fleeing in utter disgrace. But Clara knew this was only the opening act. For people entirely accustomed to parasitical entitlement and moral blackmail, hitting a brick wall would only trigger a more psychotic escalation. The very next day, a highly sensationalized post quietly appeared on social media, carrying an inflammatory clickbait title, "Exposed: How a Top Manhattan Surgeon Treats the Parents Who Sacrificed Everything for Her." Written from the perspective of an anonymous insider, the article featured emotional text and dramatic photos, spinning a modern-day fable of a farmer and a viper. It wove a tragic tale of a deeply impoverished, hard-working couple who starved themselves to send their brilliant daughter to an Ivy League medical school. The daughter graduated, became a world-class neurosurgeon, pulling in a massive 7-figure salary, and immediately turned her back on them. When her struggling father asked for a tiny bit of help to mentor her underachieving brother, she coldly refused. When her stepfather fell deathly ill and needed a hospital bed, she heartlessly told him to wait in the public queue. When the desperate parents went to the hospital to reason with her, she called armed security and treated them like violent criminals. The Post technically censored Clara's name, using Dr. V, but her hospital, her department, and even her specific job title were listed with crystal clarity. The attached photos were blurry, candid shots taken during the hospital confrontation. One was a profile shot of Clara looking completely detached and cold. The others featured Eleanor sobbing on the floor and Gary leaning weakly against a wall, looking like a martyr. Through carefully curated angles and manipulative prose, Clara was successfully painted as an utterly cold-blooded, narcissistic sociopath. The Post perfectly hit every single trigger point of the modern internet outrage machine. An ungrateful coastal elite, a cold doctor, neglected elderly parents, every tag was highly combustible. Sure enough, within a few short hours, the Post went viral across Twitter and Reddit, hitting the trending pages. The comment sections were an absolute war zone. Are doctors really this arrogant now? Refusing to treat your own sick parents? That is sickening. If her moral compass is this broken, how is she allowed to operate on brains? What if she lets a patient die out of spite? We need to dox her right now. Cancel her medical license. The hospital needs to release a statement. We cannot let a doctor with zero ethics stay in the medical field. The cyberbullying and death threats were overwhelming. The hospital's official switchboard was nearly paralyzed by thousands of phone calls from righteous internet vigilantes demanding Dr. Vance be fired immediately. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Clara was summoned to the Chief of Staff's office. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Sterling was a refined, intelligent man in his 50s. He invited Clara in and personally poured her a cup of artisanal coffee. "Clara, have you seen the firestorm online?" Dr. Sterling asked, his tone gentle but grave. Clara nodded. "I have seen it. What are your thoughts?" Clara looked at him with absolute calm. "Dr. Sterling, you have watched me climb the ranks from a first-year surgical intern to where I am today. What kind of person do you believe I am?" Dr. Sterling let out a heavy sigh. "You are the most naturally gifted, relentlessly hard-working surgeon I have ever met. I trust your clinical skills and your professional integrity with my life." He paused. "But the public relations pressure is catastrophic right now. The hospital's reputation and donor funding cannot take this kind of hit." Clara understood perfectly. He was politely asking her to find a way to make this disappear, even if it meant she had to compromise and apologize to her abusers to appease the mob. Clara reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, encrypted USB flash drive, and placed it gently on his mahogany desk. Dr. Sterling, there are two specific files on this drive. The first is the unedited, raw security camera footage from my department's corridor from yesterday morning, complete with audio. The second is a scanned PDF of my bank statements from my undergraduate and medical school years, proving my mother sent me exactly $150 a month. Alongside it is a certified copy of my parents' divorce decree. It explicitly states my mother received full custody, and my father, Richard Vance, was legally mandated to pay $500 a month in child support. The bank records prove he never paid a single cent. Clara stood up and gave a small, respectful nod. Dr. Sterling, I am deeply sorry for bringing this circus to the hospital's doorstep. My only request is that the hospital board reviews the actual evidence before making a judgment. She looked him in the eye. As for the internet mob, I do not need to issue a pathetic PR clarification, nor do I want their sympathy. I only require the truth to be published. With that, she turned and left the office. She didn't look back to see Dr. Sterling's reaction. She had done everything within her power. The rest was up to the hospital's executive board. They could either choose to sacrifice a brilliant surgeon to appease a fabricated outrage, or they could choose to defend the truth and protect their own. Walking down the tree-lined avenue outside the hospital campus, her phone continuously vibrated with unknown caller IDs and harassing text messages. She didn't even glance at the screen, simply switching the phone to airplane mode. Even if the sky collapsed, she was going to get a good night's sleep first. That was the most important survival skill she had learned over the last 10 years. The speed at which the internet outrage mutated exceeded everyone's expectations. Manhattan Pinnacle Hospital, usually revered as a globally elite institution, found itself in the center of a PR hurricane for the first time. The discourse online had escalated from judging a specific doctor's morals to launching a generalized attack on the entire medical establishment. Desperate for clicks, predatory blogs and TikTok influencers began fabricating wild, sensationalist rumors. Someone claimed Clara had plagiarized her medical thesis. Another swore she accepted under-the-table bribes from pharmaceutical companies. One even alleged she had a history of fatal medical malpractice that the hospital had covered up. The rumors grew increasingly absurd, aiming to nail Clara permanently to the cross of public shame. Watching the internet frenzy from their respective homes, Richard and Martha were ecstatic. Hiding safely behind their screens, they reveled in the intoxicating power of playing God. They were utterly convinced Clara was finished. Crushed by the monolithic weight of public outrage, the hospital board would force her to her knees. When that happened, she would be their personal puppet, doing exactly as they commanded. However, they waited an entire day. Instead of receiving a desperate, tearful phone call from Clara begging for mercy, they were greeted by an official press release from Manhattan Pinnacle Hospital. The statement was published simultaneously on the hospital's official website, Twitter, and major press networks. The headline was blunt and clinical. Official statement regarding fabricated malicious allegations against our staff. The text was brutally logical and legally airtight. Point 1. The hospital confirms the individual maliciously targeted online as Dr. Vedrim is our chief of neurosurgery, Dr. Clara Vance. Point 2. Dr. Vance possesses impeccable surgical skill and the highest standard of medical ethics. Since beginning her tenure, she has maintained a record of 0 patient complaints and 0 malpractice incidents. She is deeply trusted by her patients and peers. The online rumors regarding academic fraud and bribery are defamatory fabrications. The hospital's legal department is actively preparing to pursue aggressive litigation against the individuals originating these claims. Point 3, and the most critical point. Regarding the highly publicized family dispute, to clarify the factual events and prevent the public from being further manipulated, we are releasing the unedited security footage of the incident from the hospital's public corridor. Attached below the statement was a direct video link. The video had no dramatic background music, no deceptive jump cuts. They didn't even blur the faces. It was just a 15-minute, high-definition clip of raw, unadulterated reality. In the video, viewers could clearly see Eleanor throwing herself on the floor, thrashing like a toddler while screaming vulgar obscenities. They saw Martha aggressively pointing her finger in a nurse's face, screeching like a banshee. They saw Derek acting like a violent street thug, aggressively trying to physically assault the medical staff. And they saw Richard standing off to the side, cold and calculating, silently orchestrating the entire mob. Through it all, Clara maintained absolute icy restraint. She never uttered a single curse word. She solely focused on restoring order to a critical medical environment. Finally, hospital security arrived to evict the trespassers. The entire sequence of events was undeniable. The truth was an absolute nuke. The hospital's statement instantly detonated across the internet, causing a tectonic shift in public opinion within minutes. The exact same vigilantes who had been self-righteously screaming for Clara's head were suddenly shell-shocked. Holy shit! The biggest plot twist of the year. The abusers played the victim. These aren't parents. This is a pack of blood-sucking leeches. Throwing a violent tantrum in a neurosurgery ward? Arrest them. My heart breaks for Dr. Vance. Having a family like this is a curse. This is textbook hospital harassment. Good on the hospital for backing her up and calling security. The wind in the comment sections completely reversed, turning into a massive tsunami of support and sympathy for Clara. The original hit piece was dug up by internet sleuths, and the original poster was harassed so relentlessly they had to delete their account. The internet's wrath quickly found its true targets. Richard and Martha's personal phone numbers, home addresses, and places of employment were ruthlessly doxed by angry mobs. Their social media profiles were overrun with venomous mockery. Julian and Derek's classmates began whispering about them in the halls. Overnight, the instigators plummeted from tragic victims to universally despised pariahs. They frantically tried to delete their posts and issue pathetic defensive statements, but it was utterly useless. Against the ironclad proof of the video, their pale excuses were laughable. The public execution they had designed for Clara had swung back and locked them directly in the guillotine. The digital backlash plunged both families into unprecedented chaos. Richard's investment firm suffered immediate collateral damage. Several massive clients canceled their contracts, citing reputational risk. Eleanor couldn't even walk into Whole Foods without neighbors pointing and glaring at her. Julian was so humiliated at his prep school he developed a phobia of attending classes. Martha and Gary fared no better. Gary's fake illness was brutally mocked by his co-workers. Derek, thanks to his violent outbursts caught on camera and his subsequent unhinged arguments with internet trolls, was promptly fired by his employer. Instead of extracting a single benefit from Clara, they had completely destroyed their own lives. The inferno of rage and humiliation burned hotter and hotter in their chests. Naturally, they refused to blame themselves, projecting every ounce of their suffering onto Clara's heartlessness. Since soft extortion and public opinion had failed, they decided to resort to extreme physical confrontation. They were going to corner Clara face to face and force her to fix the mess she caused. That evening, Clara finished a long shift and drove her Audi out of the hospital's underground parking garage. Just as she merged onto the main avenue, a dark shadow burst out from the landscaping directly into the street, standing rigidly in front of her moving vehicle. Clara's pupils dilated. She slammed her foot on the brakes. The tires shrieked violently against the asphalt, the hood of the car stopping less than 2 feet away from the person. It was Martha. She had her arms spread wide like a desperate crucifix, cementing herself in the middle of the road. A second later, the driver's side window was violently pounded on. Eleanor's face, twisted with psychotic rage, pressed against the glass. Clara Vance. You little bitch! Get out of this car right now. The two rival mothers had joined forces. One played the human shield to fake an insurance scam, the other executed the ambush. Clara looked at them without a flicker of emotion. She did not open the door. She did not roll down the window to scream at them. She simply pressed the central locking button on the console, ensuring the car was a sealed vault. Then, she picked up her smartphone. Outside the car, Martha and Eleanor assumed she was finally calling them to beg for mercy. Triumphant, sinister sneers crept onto their faces. Now she's scared. Too late. If you don't fix this today, you are never leaving this street. Clara ignored their screaming completely. She dialed a number. Once connected, she spoke in an incredibly crisp, hyper-calm voice. 911. What is your emergency? I am reporting a crime in progress. I am located at the intersection of 5th Avenue and 98th Street, right near the north entrance of Manhattan Pinnacle Hospital. 2 middle-aged women have maliciously intercepted my moving vehicle on a public thoroughfare, simulating a traffic accident. They are actively attempting to breach my vehicle and issuing violent threats. Are you safe inside the vehicle, ma'am? Yes, I am secured inside. My vehicle's 4K dash cam is actively recording the entire incident. I am in no immediate physical danger, but they are blocking a major intersection. I will wait for police dispatch. Her voice wasn't loud, but the acoustic glass didn't mask it completely. The 2 women outside heard just enough to catch the drift. Martha and Eleanor froze instantly. Their smug triumph dissolved into total bewilderment and rising terror. Police! She actually called 911. How dare she? Martha rushed to the driver's window, slapping the reinforced glass like a maniac. Clara, have you lost your mind? I am your mother. You are calling the cops on your own mother over a family dispute? Eleanor shrieked from the hood of the car. Family matters, stay in the family. You call the NYPD out here. You're going to publicly humiliate all of us. Clara stared at them, her eyes flat, looking at them like two irrelevant clowns performing in a circus ring. Family matters? When they rioted in the hospital, when they slandered her name across the internet, why didn't they care about family matters then? Now, the moment their actions actually touched the edge of a felony charge, they suddenly remembered blood ties to guilt trip her. Unfortunately for them, it was too late. Clay put her phone down, reached into the center console, pulled out a bottle of sparkling water, twisted the cap, and took a slow, leisurely sip. She completely, utterly ignored the two frantic, hyperventilating faces outside her window. She had chosen the most civilized and most lethal method to resolve this farce, letting armed professionals handle unprofessional thugs. Less than 10 minutes later, the wail of police sirens approached rapidly. Martha and Eleanor's faces drained of every drop of blood. The approaching sirens sounded like the final movement in a chaotic symphony. Martha and Eleanor watched the flashing red and blue lights reflect off the surrounding buildings, their minds short-circuiting. They couldn't fathom it. How could she actually call the cops? In their deeply entrenched, archaic worldview, blood was an unbreakable chain, and domestic ugliness was something you hid behind closed doors at all costs. What could the police possibly do except make everyone lose face? Clara, however, operated on a completely different frequency. To her, dignity was something you built yourself, not something you begged from others. As for the chains of blood, she had taken a sledgehammer to them a decade ago. Two NYPD officers stepped out of their cruiser, hands resting on their utility belts, expressions stern. Who called this in? What's the situation here? Clara rolled down her window just enough to speak, her voice dead calm. I am the caller. These two women purposefully jumped in front of my moving vehicle on a major thoroughfare and are actively threatening me. My dashcam has the entire sequence in high definition. Seeing the police, Martha instantly switched masks. She rushed toward the officers, summoning crocodile tears on command. Officers, there is a huge misunderstanding. This is my daughter, my own flesh and blood. We just wanted to have a quick chat with her, but she wouldn't pull over, so we had to step in front of the car to get her attention. Eleanor desperately chimed in. Yes, exactly. We would never threaten her. She's a famous doctor. We just wanted to talk about a private family matter. The lead officer looked between the two hyperventilating women and the perfectly composed doctor in the Audi, his brow furrowed in deep annoyance. A private family matter? You think a family matter gives you the right to block traffic on a New York City avenue? Do you have any idea how dangerous this is? You're not just endangering your own lives. You are violating traffic laws and creating a massive public hazard. While the lead officer chewed them out, his partner walked over to Clara's window. Ma'am, can you provide us with the dashcam footage? Clara nodded, ejected the SD card from the console camera, and handed it over. Of course. The officer took the card back to the cruiser and plugged it into their laptop. A few minutes later, he stepped out, his face rigid. The high-definition footage left zero room for interpretation. Martha and Eleanor's actions constituted textbook reckless endangerment and disorderly conduct. The evidence was irrefutable. The officer's tone left no room for negotiation. All right, save the excuses. Both of you, turn around and put your hands behind your backs. You're coming down to the precinct for processing. Hearing she was being taken to jail, Martha completely lost her mind. Officer, please, can't we just go home? We know we messed up. We swear we'll never do it again. If people find out I was arrested, my life is ruined. Eleanor's knees gave out. In her affluent socialite circles, a criminal record was a death sentence. The officers completely ignored their pathetic begging. Now you care about your reputation? Too late for that. Get in the back of the car. Martha and Eleanor were shoved into the back of the squad car. Clara drove her Audi directly behind them. She was going to the precinct to officially hand over the evidence and file a sworn statement. The local precinct was a blindingly bright, chaotic place. Martha and Eleanor were separated into different holding areas, babbling incoherently to whoever would listen. We are her mothers. We just wanted to talk. attempting to use the illusion of family love to muddy the legal waters. Clara's statement was processed efficiently. She was highly logical and concise, detailing the entire chain of events, including the previous hospital riot and the cyber defamation campaign, providing a comprehensive backdrop of targeted harassment. She didn't embellish a single detail. She merely stated the clinical facts. But strung together, these facts painted a horrifying portrait of a victim subjected to relentless, coordinated stalking and abuse. After signing her statement, Clara sat on a wooden bench in the lobby. Richard and Gary rushed through the precinct doors. The police had called them to collect their wives. Seeing Clara sitting there calmly, Richard's fury exploded. He stormed over to her, hissing through gritted teeth. "Clara, have you completely lost your mind? You had your own mother and your stepmother thrown into a police station. What kind of sick game are you playing?" Gary chimed in from the side, trying to play peacemaker. "Clara, honey, I know you're angry, but at the end of the day, we are a family. Why drag the police into this? This is going to ruin everyone's reputation." Clara slowly lifted her gaze, looking at them as if studying two extremely annoying insects. She suddenly smiled, a soft sound dripping with lethal irony. "Reputation? When you hired internet trolls to destroy my career, did you care about my reputation? When you threw a tantrum in a hospital corridor, did you care about the hospital's reputation?" She stood up, stepping directly into Richard's personal space, locking eyes with him. "Mr. Vance, you seem to be operating under a severe delusion. I am no longer a part of your family, and haven't been for a very long time. Your people stalked and harassed me, so I called the police. That is my fundamental right as an American citizen. It has absolutely zero to do with whose DNA I share." Richard's lips trembled with rage. You. The desk sergeant walked over, cutting off their confrontation. "Richard Vance? Gary Higgins? Your spouses, Martha Higgins and Eleanor Vance, have been formally charged with reckless endangerment and disorderly conduct. The judge has denied them immediate release. They are being remanded to county jail for 5 days for a cooling-off period and psychological evaluation. Sign these acknowledgement forms." 5 days in county jail. Richard and Gary looked as if they had been struck by lightning, frozen in pure shock. They thought this was going to end with a slap on the wrist, a small fine, and a stern lecture. They never in a million years imagined their wives were actually going to be locked in a cell. Martha and Eleanor were led out in handcuffs to be transported. Hearing the mandate, they broke down completely. Eleanor shrieked at the top of her lungs. "I am not going to Rikers. I didn't commit a real crime." Martha stared at Clara with eyes full of pure, undiluted hatred. "Clara, you set me up! You goddamn monster! You'll rot in hell for this!" Clara was entirely deaf to their curses. She politely nodded to the desk sergeant. "Thank you for your professionalism, officer. If that is all, I will be taking my leave." The sergeant nodded back respectfully. "Of course, Dr. Vance. If they attempt to contact you again upon release, you have more than enough grounds to file for an emergency restraining order." "Understood. Thank you." Clara turned around and walked out of the precinct without looking back. The night air of New York was crisp and cold, hitting her face. She took a deep breath, feeling an unprecedented sense of clarity. When dealing with toxic waste, you throw it in the incinerator. When dealing with a virus, you isolate and sanitize. That is the most scientific, most efficient methodology. You do not reason with a virus, you annihilate it. Today, she had executed a flawless sterilization protocol. The news that Martha and Eleanor were spending 5 days in a county holding cell dropped like a bombshell, blasting the two families into total disarray. To them, this was a catastrophic humiliation. When the two women finally walked out of the holding facility, they looked as if their souls had been sucked out. Eleanor, who prided herself on being a high society socialite, now had a criminal mugshot in the system. She unleashed all her pent-up trauma onto Richard. "This is all your fault. If you hadn't insisted on poking that psychopathic bitch, I would never have suffered like this. Richard, I swear to God, this isn't over." Richard, battered from all sides, found his hatred for Clara reaching a boiling point. He couldn't fathom how he had sired a daughter made of impenetrable titanium and ice. Over at the Higgins residence, it was absolute chaos. Martha spent her days sobbing on the couch, cursing Clara to suffer a horrible death. Derek was practically foaming at the mouth. "Mom, Dad, are we really just gonna let this slide? She threw my own mother in a jail cell. I'm not swallowing this." After the brutal clashes of the past few weeks, They had finally realized one horrifying truth. Playing the family card with Clara was useless. Trying to cancel her online resulted in a devastating counterattack. Trying to physically intimidate her resulted in jail time. This daughter, or rather, this mortal enemy, had evolved far beyond their comprehension and control. They were trapped in a state of impotent, raging frenzy. After stewing in silence for a few days, Richard invited Gary and Derek out for a drink. Two men who previously despised each other were now sitting in a dark booth together, united by a common foe. Richard's face was dark enough to rival a thunderstorm. "We've tried the soft approach and the hard approach. Nothing works. Her wings are completely hardened. She looks at us like we're dirt on her shoe." Derek slammed his beer down, his eyes vicious. "Then we break her wings. What does she care about the most? Her god-tier reputation as a surgeon, right? We hit her right in the medical license." A dark, venomous gleam flashed in Richard's eyes. "My thoughts exactly. If we destroy her reputation so thoroughly that no hospital in the country will hire her, let's see how arrogant she acts then." A far more sinister conspiracy began taking shape in the shadows. They knew basic social media rumors were useless now. Clara's hospital had already proven they would defend her against gossip. This time, they needed to play the ultimate trump card, something that would force the hospital board to throw Clara under the bus to save themselves. They were going to frame her for fatal medical malpractice. Richard leveraged his deep pockets and shady corporate connections, hiring a private investigator to dig through the dark corners of the hospital network. He was looking for any case Clara had operated on that ended in death or severe complications. He scoured the data like a viper in the sewers, looking for a single crack to sink his fangs into. Finally, they found their target. It was a patient from 6 months ago, a man in his late 60s. The man had suffered from an aggressive, highly complex brain tumor, making the surgery incredibly high risk. Clara had been the lead surgeon. The procedure itself had been a masterpiece, the tumor perfectly excised. Tragically, 3 days post-op, the elderly man suffered a massive, fatal myocardial infarction, a severe heart attack, and passed away. This was a well-documented, unfortunate reality of medicine. Critical patients possess fragile systems, and post-operative stress can easily trigger secondary organ failure. The hospital's Morbidity and Mortality (M&M) committee had thoroughly reviewed the case and officially concluded the surgical team was 0% at fault. The cause of death was an underlying cardiac comorbidity. The family, though devastated, had been understanding and had not pursued any legal action against the hospital. But now, Richard and his cabal dug this family out of the woodwork. Richard, Martha, Eleanor, and Gary formed an unholy alliance. Armed with a briefcase full of cash, they tracked down the deceased man's son and daughter-in-law. Initially, the grieving couple wanted no part in the drama, but they couldn't withstand the relentless brainwashing from the four manipulators. They painted Clara as a fame-obsessed butcher who forced an elderly man into an unnecessary surgery just to boost her own success metrics. They insinuated Clara made a catastrophic surgical error and covered it up. They claimed Clara's post-operative negligence directly murdered the man. They passionately swore to fund the family's legal battle to get justice for their father. Most importantly, Richard promised the son a massive sum of cash under the table enough to ensure he wouldn't have to work for the next 20 years. Tempted by the massive payout and blinded by the fabricated lies, the previously reasonable couple caved. The primal greed of human nature conquered their moral compass. A few days later, a highly orchestrated press conference was held in the conference room of a Midtown Hilton. The deceased man's son and daughter-in-law sat before a dozen flashing cameras from predatory tabloid blogs and local news stations, sobbing hysterically while clutching a framed photo of the deceased. Behind them, a massive banner displayed bold, black letters. "Butcher surgeon Clara Vance murdered our father. We demand justice." Through a stream of theatrical tears, they accused Clara of coercing a fragile man into a dangerous surgery just to pad her own resume. They accused her of gross surgical negligence. They accused her of abandoning their father in the ICU to die. They claimed the hospital's internal investigation was a corrupt institutional cover-up designed to protect a star doctor. This accusation was 100 times more lethal than the previous ungrateful daughter narrative. This was a direct, targeted strike at a doctor's professional throat. The news went nuclear instantly. Elite Manhattan neurosurgeon, accused of forcing unnecessary surgery, resulting in death. The headline hijacked the entire internet ecosystem. Having learned from the previous plot twist, many netizens were cautious this time, However, Richard had unleashed a massive army of paid internet bots to flood the zone with misinformation, spinning endless conspiracy theories about elite hospital cover-ups. The water was successfully muddied, and Manhattan Pinnacle Hospital was dragged back into a catastrophic PR nightmare. This time, the nature of the crisis was entirely different. It touched the absolute third rail of healthcare: patient safety and medical malpractice. Clara knocked gently on the chief of staff's door. "Come in." Dr. Sterling's voice sounded profoundly exhausted. Clara walked in to find him staring intensely at the CNN newsfeed on his monitor, his brows locked in a deep grimace. "Dr. Sterling." Clara's voice was as steady as ever. He looked up at her, his eyes carrying a heavy, complex weight. "Dr. Vance, what is your assessment of this situation?" Clara pulled out a chair and sat down, displaying zero panic. "It is a complete fabrication. From their underlying motive to their specific clinical accusations, it is 100% fraud." Dr. Sterling sighed heavily. "I believe you, Clara. I read the M&M report myself, but the external pressure right now is apocalyptic. The family has officially filed a grievance with the state medical board. By federal and state regulation, until the board clears you, the hospital is legally forced to take administrative action." He paused, clearly struggling to get the words out. "The executive board has voted. You are suspended from all clinical duties, effective immediately. That includes all surgeries and outpatient consultations. You are required to fully cooperate with the state medical board's investigation. Suspended from all clinical duties." Those words were like an invisible blade plunged directly into a surgeon's heart. For Clara, the operating room was her sanctuary, her battlefield, the singular place where her existence held undeniable value. Stripping her of her scalpel was tantamount to breaking her legs. This was precisely the victory Richard and his crew had designed. Clara remained silent. The office fell into a suffocating, graveyard stillness. Dr. Sterling watched her, a flash of pity in his eyes. He assumed this historically resilient, brilliant young doctor had finally been broken. A few seconds later, Clara lifted her head. Her eyes were not broken. They were crystal clear, terrifyingly calm, and glinting with a razor-sharp, predatory light. "I understand," she nodded, accepting the decree. "I will fully cooperate with the investigators. However, Dr. Sterling," her tone suddenly shifted, growing dangerously sharp, "I expect the hospital board to understand that this is not a routine medical malpractice dispute. This is a highly coordinated, criminal conspiracy designed to destroy me and extort this hospital. I will not be sitting on my hands. When I return to my post," she continued, "I will have eradicated every single person responsible for this." She stood up, gave Dr. Sterling a brief nod, and walked out of the office. Her silhouette showed not a single ounce of defeat. Instead, she looked like a sword drawn from its sheath, gleaming with lethal intent. Her retreat was merely a tactical repositioning for a kill shot. For many, a forced suspension would be an agonizing purgatory. For Clara, it was a rare, highly valuable window of unrestricted time to surgically dismantle her enemies. She did not spiral into self-doubt or panic, as her enemies gleefully prayed she would. Her brain, operating like a hyper-advanced supercomputer, instantly formulated a ruthless counteroffensive. Phase 1. Data acquisition. Her first move was to legally obtain the complete, unredacted medical file of the deceased patient. From the initial ER intake forms, MRI scans, and surgical logs, to the exact dosages of anesthesia, every single post-op nursing note, and the cardiac telemetry strips. She locked herself in her apartment study for 48 hours straight. Like a forensic investigator, she scrutinized every microscopic detail. She reverse-engineered the entire clinical pathway, verifying every split-second decision and every microscopic incision. Her conclusion mirrored the hospital board's initial findings perfectly. Her surgical execution had been flawless. The medical science was an impenetrable fortress. Her clinical excellence was her ultimate armor. Phase 2. Heavy artillery. Clara knew this war had escalated far beyond the realm of medicine. This was a high-stakes legal and public relations bloodbath, and she needed an apex predator by her side. Through her extensive network of elite New York contacts, she secured the absolute best medical defamation and litigation firm in Manhattan. She didn't blink at the retainer fee, demanding the immediate services of their managing partner, Harper Thorne. Harper Thorne was a formidable, sharply dressed woman in her late 40s, known for destroying opposing counsel in federal court. After listening to Clara's clinical breakdown and reviewing the patient files, Harper's eyes gleamed with deep admiration. "Doctor, Vance, purely from a medical jurisprudence standpoint, your liability is zero. The case is a joke. Now, our objective shifts to proving the plaintiffs are committing perjury and malicious prosecution. Clara nodded. That is exactly why you are here. I strongly suspect the patient's family is acting as a proxy. The architects of this extortion are my biological parents. Harper's glasses caught the light. Do you have hard evidence? Not yet, Clara admitted openly, but basic logic dictates it. A working-class family from the outer boroughs does not have the logistical capacity to orchestrate a press conference at a Midtown Hilton, nor the capital to hire a bot farm. There is heavy financial backing here. Harper nodded slowly. I see the angle. I will deploy my firm's private investigators immediately. I need you to sign authorizations allowing us to subpoena the financial and telecommunication records of specific individuals. Clara slid a pre-written list across the mahogany table. It contained the names of Richard Vance, Eleanor Vance, Martha Higgins, Gary Higgins, Derek Higgins, and even Julian Vance. She didn't spare a single one. Done. Phase 3. Seizing the narrative. While waiting for the investigators to work their magic, Clara did not remain idle. She accepted an exclusive, sit-down interview with a highly respected, Emmy Award-winning national news program, the kind of show known for grueling, objective journalism, not cheap sensationalism. Under the blinding studio lights, facing a veteran journalist who pulled no punches, Clara didn't dodge a single question. For the first time in her life, she publicly narrated her entire history. She spoke of her parents' vicious divorce when she was 12, the subsequent abandonment, and the emotional starvation she endured from 2 hostile new families. She described the grueling, solitary path of funding her own education to become a neurosurgeon. She didn't cry. She didn't play the victim. Her tone was eerily calm and meticulously restrained, as if she were presenting a clinical case study of someone else's life. Yet, that very stoicism carried a devastating emotional payload. She systematically dismantled the ungrateful daughter narrative, explaining the reality behind the hospital riot. When the anchor pressed her on the medical malpractice allegations, Clara stared directly into the camera lens, articulating every word with lethal precision. First, the loss of that patient was a tragedy, and my surgical team and I carry the weight of that loss deeply. Second, I will stake my medical license, my entire career, and my personal honor on this fact. During the entirety of his care, my team and I executed our duties with absolute perfection. Every clinical intervention exceeded national standards. We have zero liability, and we have zero guilt. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. Third, while I empathize with the grieving process of the family, I have zero tolerance for them being weaponized to fabricate perjury and maliciously assassinate my character. Fourth, I trust the American legal system, and I trust empirical facts. I am fully cooperating with the state medical board, and I have retained top-tier legal counsel. I will not stop until every single individual who conspired to engineer this extortion ring faces the absolute maximum penalty under federal and state law. Whoever they are, her gaze was unyielding, piercing through the television screens of millions of viewers. The broadcast triggered an immediate, seismic shift in the cultural narrative. This time, the scales of public opinion slammed entirely in Clara's favor. Her image, an extraordinarily resilient, hyper-competent, rational professional, stood in grotesque contrast to the parasitic, greedy, and hysterical behavior of her so-called family. Millions of viewers became instant, fierce defenders of Dr. Vance. This isn't cold-blooded, this is survival. If my family treated me like a bank account, I'd block them too. The sheer amount of abuse she survived just to become a neurosurgeon. She is a literal superhero. Destroy those extortionists, Dr. Vance. Put them all in federal prison. Watching the broadcast in their respective homes, Richard and his co-conspirators smashed their television sets in blind rage. This ungrateful bitch! How dare she drag our dirty laundry onto national television? Richard was consumed by panic. He could feel the situation violently spiraling out of his control. He had catastrophically underestimated Clara's titanium willpower and her capacity for total warfare. But there was no turning back now. He was in too deep. He doubled down, aggressively pressuring the deceased patient's family to keep escalating the protests, to picket outside the medical board offices, to stage protests outside the hospital. He wanted to drown the truth in pure chaos, hoping the hospital would force Clara to settle. Just as the stalemate reached its peak, Harper Thorne's investigators delivered the kill shot. A team of ex-CIA private investigators had successfully photographed Richard Vance and Derek Higgins meeting in secret with the deceased patient's son at an exclusive, discreet cigar lounge in Manhattan. Even more devastating, through high-level subpoenas, they acquired the Holy Grail, bank wire transfer records. Exactly 48 hours before the Hilton press conference, a shell corporation controlled by Richard Vance wired exactly $100,000 into an offshore LLC. That exact LLC then wired $100,000 directly into the personal checking account of the patient's son. The chain of evidence was a flawless, airtight loop of criminal conspiracy. The moment Harper Thorne reviewed the documents, she dialed Clara's number, a predatory thrill in her voice. "Dr. Vance, we have the kill code." On the other end of the line, the corners of Clara's mouth finally curled into an Arctic smile. "Excellent. Let them know the game is over." The atmosphere in Harper Thorne's massive corner office was lethal, the panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline serving as a backdrop to the impending execution. Clara looked at the evidence fanned out across the glass table, her eyes like still water. A photograph. Richard and Derek clinking glasses with the grieving son in a smoky, secluded lounge. A bank statement. $100,000. The digital paper trail that chained these greedy, malicious conspirators together for federal prosecutors to see. The evidence is locked. Harper pushed her designer glasses up the bridge of her nose, her gaze razor sharp. "What is your next play? Do we file the civil suit immediately, or turn this over to the district attorney?" Clara picked up her cup of black tea and gently blew on the surface. "Harper, what is your professional opinion? When dealing with a rabid dog, is it more satisfying to quietly lock it in a cage, or to break its legs in the middle of Times Square so the whole world learns a lesson?" Harper paused, then let out a low, appreciative laugh. She understood exactly what her client wanted. "I like your metaphors, doctor. You want to incinerate their reputations permanently." Clara set the teacup down. Her voice was soft, yet it carried the weight of a collapsing star. "They attempted to use the court of public opinion to execute me. I am going to use empirical facts to publicly guillotine them in that exact same court. I want every single person in this country to see the grotesque, mutated faces of my so-called family." 3 days later, an ultra-high-security press conference was convened in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. It was hosted exclusively by Harper Thorne's elite law firm. Every major news network in the country, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, NYT, and top legal correspondents was present. The entire press corps was vibrating with curiosity. What kind of apocalyptic evidence required Harper Thorne herself to host a live broadcast? At exactly 10:00 a.m., the ballroom lights dimmed. Clara and Harper walked out onto the main stage side by side. A blinding storm of camera flashes erupted. Clara was not wearing her white coat today. She wore a perfectly tailored, midnight black designer suit, her hair pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving bun. She radiated the aura of a highly lethal corporate assassin. Her mere presence sent a shockwave of electricity through the press corps. Harper Thorne approached the podium first, her voice booming through the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press, good morning. We have invited you here today to release highly anticipated, irrefutable evidence regarding the malicious medical malpractice allegations targeted at my client, Dr. Clara Vance." The moment she finished speaking, the massive IMAX screen behind them illuminated, projecting the high-definition photograph of the cigar lounge. Richard, Derek, and the grieving son, John, were sitting around a table, laughing, smoking cigars. The timestamp placed the photo exactly 2 days prior to the initial defamation press conference. Harper's tone was devoid of mercy. "The 3 men on this screen require no introduction. On the left is my client's estranged biological father, Richard Vance. In the middle is her estranged stepbrother, Derek Higgins. And on the right, the man who stood before you in tears, accusing my client of murder, Mr. John Miller." A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. Journalists frantically mashed their camera shutters. This was a Pulitzer-level scandal. But the true nuke had yet to drop. Harper clicked a remote. The screen switched to a highly magnified, undeniable bank wire transfer receipt. Originating account, Vance Holdings LLC. Receiving account, John Miller. Amount, $100,000. Date, 48 hours prior to the Hilton press conference. "These are certified bank records obtained via federal subpoena," Harper's voice echoed like a judge reading a death sentence. $100,000 to purchase a lie. $100,000 to assassinate the character of one of this nation's top neurosurgeons. I ask everyone in this room, is this a medical malpractice dispute? Or is this a highly coordinated, criminal conspiracy of extortion, wire fraud, and felony perjury? Harper's words slammed into the room with the force of a freight train. The ballroom fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The sheer brutality of the ironclad evidence left the journalists speechless. A few seconds later, the room exploded into a chaotic roar of questions. Dr. Vance, how are you feeling right now? Dr. Vance, what legal actions are you preparing to take? Clara stepped up to her microphone. This was the first time she had spoken today. Her calm, predatory gaze swept across the sea of flashing cameras. My emotional state is completely calm, because I have known from day one that my medical integrity was flawless. She paused, her eyes suddenly turning as cold and sharp as a scalpel. As for legal action, my legal team has officially filed a multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit in federal court for defamation, libel, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The named defendants include Richard Vance, Martha Higgins, Eleanor Vance, Gary Higgins, Derek Higgins, Julian Vance, and John Miller. I will not grant a single ounce of mercy to any of them. Furthermore, Clara's voice dropped an octave, turning to absolute ice. We have formally handed this entire dossier over to the United States Attorney's Office and the District Attorney, because extortion, wire fraud, and perjury are not just civil disputes. They are federal felonies. I expect them to pay the ultimate price for their crimes. That price will not merely be financial bankruptcy. It will be years in a federal penitentiary. Her words sliced through the air like a bloody katana. She didn't want apologies. She didn't want a settlement. She wanted them in prison jumpsuits. Clara's press conference triggered a Category 5 media hurricane, infinitely more destructive than the clumsy smear campaign Richard had attempted. This was primetime, mainstream, undeniable annihilation. Bombshell. Accused surgeon exposes father's $100K extortion plot. The depths of greed. Family conspires to destroy top neurosurgeon for cash. From cyberbullying to federal felonies, the fall of the Vance family. Every major news portal plastered the wire transfer receipts and the cigar lounge photo on their front pages. The internet went completely apocalyptic. If the public had felt sympathy for Clara before, now they were consumed by unadulterated, righteous fury. This was no longer a messy family drama. This was a sickening display of pure human evil. Lock them all up. Throw away the key. What kind of demonic parents frame their own daughter for medical murder? Pure psychopaths. Dr. Vance is an absolute queen for bringing the receipts. Bury them in lawsuits. Richard's phone exploded with calls. His firm's switchboard melted down as thousands of furious citizens called in to scream at him. Anonymous hackers breached his corporate servers, replacing his website's homepage with a black-and-white mugshot-style photo of him and Martha with the word extortionist stamped across their faces. His Wall Street partners and investors instantly severed all ties, desperate to avoid the toxic fallout. His company's stock price plummeted into the abyss overnight. Richard's entire empire was disintegrating. Martha and Eleanor locked themselves in their respective homes, terrified to even look out the window. Their addresses were viral again. This time, there was no pity. Neighbors spray-painted scum and extortionists on their garage doors. They were trapped like rats in a sinking ship. But the first person to completely crack under the psychological warfare was the bribed son, John Miller. When he watched the news and realized Clara wasn't just suing him, but actively working with the district attorney to lock him in a federal prison, his knees gave out. He was just a greedy coward. He didn't want to spend a decade in a cell for wire fraud. Clutching the $100,000 he hadn't even had the chance to spend, he rushed to Richard's office, falling to his knees and begging him to fix it. Richard, currently drowning in his own catastrophic ruin, had zero patience for the sniveling pawn. He literally kicked John out of his office. "Get the hell out of here, you useless piece of trash." Driven into a corner of absolute despair, John made a desperate, self-preserving calculation. He grabbed his wife and marched directly into the local NYPD precinct to turn himself in. To secure a plea deal and immunity from federal wire fraud charges, he surrendered the $100,000 in dirty money and sang like a canary. He detailed every single aspect of the conspiracy: how Richard recruited him, how he used cash to buy his lies, how Eleanor and Martha coached them on how to cry for the cameras, and exactly who formulated the murdering surgeon script. He even handed over a secret audio recording he had made on his iPhone while negotiating the bribe with Richard to ensure he wouldn't get ripped off. That audio recording was the final, devastating nail in the coffin. It was the golden ticket for a grand jury indictment. A week later, the State Medical Board officially released its findings. Dr. Clara Vance's clinical execution was exemplary. Her decisions were flawless. There is zero evidence of medical negligence. Manhattan Pinnacle Hospital immediately convened an emergency all-staff assembly in the Grand Auditorium. Dr. Sterling personally took the stage. In front of hundreds of doctors, nurses, and board members, he issued a profound, public apology to Clara. Because of the hospital administration's overly cautious and bureaucratic response to a crisis, Dr. Clara Vance was subjected to an unjust suspension and forced to endure unimaginable psychological trauma. On behalf of the executive board, I offer Dr. Vance our deepest, most unreserved apologies. Furthermore, we are immediately reinstating Dr. Vance to all clinical and administrative duties. The hospital will provide the full weight of our legal department to support her in destroying the individuals who attempted to defame this institution. The auditorium erupted into deafening, thunderous applause. It was a standing ovation of genuine awe and deep respect from her peers. Clara walked onto the stage and accepted the microphone from Dr. Sterling. She looked out at the sea of familiar faces in white coats and scrubs, giving a small, dignified bow. "Thank you, Dr. Sterling. Thank you, everyone. I only have one thing to say. A scalpel is a sacred tool used to save lives. It should never be weaponized to fight human garbage. To fight human garbage, we use a much sharper, much more brutal instrument, the United States justice system." Her words echoed with absolute, titanium strength. The Queen had returned to her throne. Not only had she cleansed her name of every drop of mud, but she had also emerged from the fire as a terrifyingly powerful, untouchable force of nature, reclaiming everything that was rightfully hers. Once the gears of the American legal system begin to grind, they do not stop until they crush whatever is in their path. Bolstered by John Miller's confession and the mountain of financial evidence, the district attorney's office moved with lethal speed. Grand jury indictments were handed down. Richard, Martha, Eleanor, Gary, and Derek were all formally arrested and charged. Even Julian, despite being a minor, was hauled in for questioning regarding his participation in the cyber-stalking campaign, resulting in a permanent mark on his juvenile record. The adults were indicted on felony charges of conspiracy to commit extortion, wire fraud, and perjury. The two families were thrown into absolute, hyperventilating terror. They frantically scrambled to hire defense attorneys. But the moment any reputable white-collar defense lawyer saw Harper Thorne's name on the opposing civil docket and the DA's slam-dunk evidence, they immediately declined. No high-end lawyer wanted to attach their name to a completely radioactive, unwinnable case. Eventually, they had to scrape the bottom of the barrel, hiring a few desperate, low-rent attorneys. The legal advice they all received was identical. You are going to prison. Your only chance of avoiding maximum sentencing is to get down on your knees and beg Dr. Vance to sign a victim impact statement asking the judge for leniency. And so, the most grotesque, absurd spectacle began to unfold. The very people who had spent months trying to slaughter Clara's career were now desperately crawling through the mud, begging for her salvation. The first to call was Richard. His voice had completely lost its arrogant, billionaire cadence. Instead, it was frail, exhausted, and laced with pathetic, trembling desperation. Clara, Daddy made a mistake. I was confused. I lost my temper. Please, I'm begging you. For the sake of our blood, please tell the DA to drop the charges, okay? My firm is going bankrupt. I can't survive federal prison. Clara listened to the voice on the other end, so familiar, yet so entirely alien. She actually found it quite humorous. Mr. Vance, you seem to be suffering from dementia. My cooperation with the district attorney has absolutely nothing to do with whether you share my DNA. I am assisting the prosecution in locking up a criminal who committed felony extortion and wire fraud. Your current objective should not be begging me. It should be consulting your public defender on how to cry convincingly in front of the federal judge to get a reduced sentence for showing remorse. Click. Clara terminated the call instantly. Seconds later, Martha's number bypassed the block via a burner phone. The moment Clara answered, a hysterical wailing erupted. My sweet baby girl. Mommy is so sorry. I know I was wrong. Please, spare me just this once. I don't want to go to prison. Who's going to take care of your brother Derek? Clara's tone remained at absolute zero, capable of freezing the moisture in the air. Mrs. Higgins, You seem to have forgotten something. Your son, Derek, is a co-defendant on the federal indictment. If you're lucky, the judge will assign you to the same minimum security facility so you can take care of him in the cafeteria line. Consider it a unique family reunion. Martha's screaming choked in her throat as if she had swallowed glass. Before she could gasp for air, Clara hung up. After that, Eleanor and Gary attempted to breach her defenses using every conceivable method. They sent tragic, Shakespearean emails. They tried to deploy distant relatives to act as emissaries. Clara ignored every single one. She changed her phone number, blocked every associated IP address, and deployed a total communications blackout. She used the most brutal, effective method to isolate the noise. She poured her entire existence back into her true passion: the operating room, ICU rounds, and mentoring her surgical residents. It was as if the apocalyptic war of the past few months had never even occurred. The surgical staff watched her slender, unyielding silhouette walking down the halls, their eyes filled with deep reverence. This is what a genuinely indestructible woman looks like. Only the charge nurse, when no one else was around, cautiously asked her, "Dr. Vance, are you really not going to show them any mercy? I mean, at the end of the day, they are still..." Clara, who was analyzing a complex CT scan on her tablet, didn't even lift her head. She replied evenly, "If a single drop of toxic pesticide falls into a bowl of expensive soup, do you drink the soup and lie to yourself that it's fine? Or do you pour the entire bowl, pesticide included, straight down the drain?" The charge nurse was stunned, then immediately understood. Some damage is radioactive. Once contaminated, the only cure is total, uncompromising amputation. It wasn't about a lack of forgiveness. It was about the fact that they simply did not qualify to exist in her universe. Days later, the official federal court summons arrived at Richard's and Martha's residences. Staring at the terrifyingly stark seal of the United States District Court, reality finally set in. Clara was not bluffing. She was not playing a game. She was going to personally push them into the abyss. Pure, suffocating terror drowned them. They turned on each other like rabid dogs. Richard screamed that Eleanor was a useless parasite who instigated the whole thing. Eleanor shrieked that Richard was a pathetic failure of a man. Martha and Gary tore each other to shreds in their living room. The two fractured, loveless marriages completely imploded under the crushing pressure of impending incarceration. Meanwhile, the architect of their destruction, Dr. Clara Vance, was standing under the blinding surgical lights, executing a microscopic brainstem tumor resection. Her eyes were laser-focused, her hands as steady as a machine. The chaotic noise of the outside world could not penetrate her sanctuary. In her world, there was only the patient and the scalpel. This was her true, undisputed empire. The trial date was set for early winter. The New York weather was bitterly cold and gray, perfectly matching the psychological state of the defendants. They had spent the last few weeks living in a waking nightmare. Begging had failed. Threats were impossible. The sword of Damocles was dropping, and they were trapped in sheer, frantic panic. Driven by this manic desperation, they orchestrated one final, spectacularly pathetic Hail Mary. They decided to ambush Clara at the hospital one last time before the trial. This time, they abandoned the aggressive screaming. They pivoted to weaponized pity, bringing out their ultimate emotional nuclear warheads. Clara's paternal grandmother and maternal grandmother, two fragile, elderly women, one pushing 80, the other in her mid-70s. Since Clara was 12, these women had not made a single attempt to contact her. It was as if their granddaughter had ceased to exist. Now, they were dragged all the way from their rural homes in the Midwest to New York City, propped up like two dusty theatrical props, for the grand finale of this grotesque family soap opera. That afternoon, Clara had just finished a marathon surgery. Changing out of her scrubs, she walked into the corridor to find a highly orchestrated, nauseatingly sentimental scene waiting for her. Richard and Martha were flanking the two elderly women, holding them up with performative gentleness. Eleanor and Gary stood a few feet back, their eyes conveniently red, faces twisted in manufactured grief. Julian and Derek hung their heads, doing their best impression of deeply reformed, repentant youths. They formed a human barricade, completely blocking Clara's path to the elevators. Spotting Clara, Richard immediately nudged his elderly mother. The grandmother shuffled forward on trembling legs, squeezing a few cloudy tears from her eyes. "Clara, sweetie, it's your Nana. Look how big you've grown. Your father, he knows he messed up. Just forgive him, please. He is your real father." If you send my son to a federal prison, Nana will just die of a broken heart. Saying this, she theatrically buckled her knees, pretending to collapse onto the floor to beg. Clara did not move a single muscle. She didn't even extend a hand to catch the woman. She just stood there, cold and utterly detached, watching this grandmother she hadn't seen in over a decade use D-list acting to execute a moral hostage situation. On the other side, Martha dragged the maternal grandmother forward. Her crying was even louder. "My Clara, my beautiful granddaughter. Your mother had such a hard life. She raised you all by herself. She's just getting old and confused. She made a silly mistake. Look at my gray hair. Clara, show your grandmother some respect and let her off the hook. Have some pity on two dying old women." The two elderly women played off each other flawlessly, howling and wailing. A crowd of bystanders had already gathered in the lobby, whispering and pointing at Clara. "That doctor is too cold. Her own grandmothers are begging on their knees. Yeah, no matter what they did, they're still blood. You can't just send them to prison." A microscopic gleam of triumph flashed across Richard and Martha's faces. They refused to believe that Clara could maintain her Terminator-like composure while being publicly shamed by two weeping, elderly grandmothers in front of a massive crowd. But once again, they drastically underestimated the evolution of Clara Vance. Clara looked at the two complete strangers crying at her feet and suddenly let out a soft, highly amused chuckle. She completely ignored their wailing. Instead, she turned her head toward the charge nurse who had rushed over. Her voice was not loud, but the acoustics of the lobby carried it perfectly to every single bystander. "Nurse, could you please contact hospital administration for me?" The charge nurse blinked. "Administration? For what, Dr. Vance?" Clara's gaze drifted back to the two elderly women, her eyes glinting with a predatory, mocking curiosity. "Could you verify if these two elderly women are the newly hired background actors for the hospital's trauma training simulation? Their acting is fantastic. The crying is very visceral, but the script is a bit cliché. He is your real father. Show your grandmother some respect. It's very melodramatic. I suggest whoever wrote this ask my hourly consultation rate next time before they cast these extras." Dead silence. The entire lobby was instantly stunned by Clara's bizarre, completely out of left field response. Background actors? Hourly rates? What the hell is she talking about? The grandmother's wailing screeched to a halt like a scratched record. They stared at Clara in dumbfounded shock, unable to comprehend that this razor-tongued woman was the granddaughter they were supposed to manipulate. Richard's face flushed a violent, apoplectic purple. "Clara, what the hell are you talking about? This is your biological grandmother." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Oh, is she?" She took a slow, deliberate step toward her paternal grandmother, leaning down so they were exactly at eye level. "Ma'am, do you remember the exact year you last saw me?" The grandmother opened her mouth, stammered, and produced zero sound. Clara then pivoted smoothly to her maternal grandmother. "And you, ma'am, do you remember what score I got on my SATs? Or what Ivy League university I attended?" The maternal grandmother froze, her face totally blank. Clara straightened her posture, sweeping her gaze across the entire crowd of gawking bystanders. Her voice rang out, crisp, lethal, and brutally clear. "When I was a child, freezing, starving, and begging for a family, not a single one of you existed. Now, when I am deploying the United States legal system to protect myself from felony extortion, you suddenly pop out of the woodwork like cockroaches. You want to put on a show?" She pulled her smartphone out of her pocket and aimed the camera directly at the group. "Come on, keep acting for the 4K camera. I am going to take this high-definition footage, bundle it with the hospital security footage of your previous riot, and hand it directly to the federal judge. I want His Honor to enjoy a front-row seat to how the defendants are organizing a mob to harass, intimidate, and tamper with a federal witness outside the courtroom. I am absolutely certain the judge will factor this heavily into your mandatory minimum sentencing." Staring into the black, unblinking lens of Clara's camera, Richard and his crew looked as if they were staring down the barrel of a loaded shotgun. The fake, theatrical grief instantly morphed into sheer, unadulterated panic and humiliating defeat. The two grandmothers, who had been howling seconds before, were so terrified they didn't dare breathe. A meticulously planned, weaponized guilt trip had been completely atomized by Clara, using a strategy they couldn't even comprehend. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't cursed, yet her clinical, icy logic made them want the earth to swallow them whole. She was an elegant matador. Using nothing but a small red cape, She had manipulated the raging, brainless bulls into charging headfirst into a solid brick wall, cracking their own skulls open. The federal district court was a monolith of solemnity and absolute silence. The harsh, fluorescent lights beamed down on the faces of everyone in the room, illuminating their disparate fates. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table, her spine perfectly straight, her expression an impenetrable fortress of calm. Directly across from her, at the defense table, sat a row of deeply familiar faces: Richard, Eleanor, Martha, Gary, and Derek. They looked like walking corpses. Their eyes darted nervously, entirely stripped of their former arrogance and predatory calculation. Richard and Martha, in particular, looked as if they had aged 20 years in a matter of months. The gallery was packed with journalists. Cameras were strictly prohibited, but every reporter had their notebook open, ready to document this highly sensationalized collision of blood ties and federal law. The trial commenced. Harper Thorne, acting as Clara's lead counsel, stood up to deliver the opening statement. Her voice was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of logic and power. Your Honor, members of the jury, the facts of this case are not in dispute. The defendants, Richard Vance, Martha Higgins, and their co-conspirators, driven by a toxic combination of entitlement and greed, when their financial demands were not met, engaged in a highly organized, malicious conspiracy to destroy my client, Dr. Clara Vance. They began by staging a physical riot at a critical care hospital, attempting to weaponize mob mentality to extort her. When that failed, they escalated to a coordinated cyberstalking campaign, publishing defamatory lies to destroy her reputation. When Dr. Vance remained unbroken, they orchestrated a plot of pure, unadulterated evil. Harper's voice echoed off the oak-paneled walls. They utilized a shell corporation to wire $100,000 to Mr. John Miller, purchasing a fabricated story of medical malpractice. They hosted a press conference to accuse a brilliant neurosurgeon of murder. The sheer depravity of their actions has long bypassed the realm of a family dispute. This is felony extortion, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy. She approached the clerk and handed over a massive binder of evidence. The hospital security footage, the IP logs of the defamatory Reddit posts, the high-resolution photos of the cigar lounge meeting, the subpoenaed bank records of the $100,000 wire transfer, and the absolute nail in the coffin, the signed confession and audio recordings from their cooperating witness, John Miller. The chain of evidence was a steel vault, irrefutable. At the defense table, Richard and his crew buried their heads in their hands. Their defense attorney stood up, launching into a deeply pathetic, hollow argument. His entire strategy relied on the same tired, archaic, emotional manipulation. Your Honor, it must be noted that a unique blood relationship exists between the defendants and the plaintiff. Richard Vance and Martha Higgins are her biological parents. While their methods were highly unorthodox and deeply flawed, their core intention was merely to secure the attention and assistance of their daughter. This is a tragedy of escalated domestic miscommunication. They harbored no true malicious intent to destroy her. He swallowed hard. As for the $100,000, it was merely an act of profound charity, a compassionate financial settlement for a grieving family who lost their father. Even the defense attorney sounded like he wanted to crawl under the table. A wave of muffled, derisive laughter rippled through the press gallery. A $100,000 anonymous charity donation? It was an insult to the intelligence of every single person in the room. The cross-examination was an absolute slaughter. Richard was called to the stand. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit, his hair completely white, his eyes shaking with terror. Harper Thorne approached the podium, her gaze burning like a laser. Mr. Vance, you testified that you wired $100,000 to your daughter's former patient's family purely out of compassion. Is that correct? Richard swallowed thickly, nodding. Yes. Harper smiled, a terrifying, predatory expression. Fascinating. Dr. Vance has operated on thousands of patients over her decade-long career. Statistically, a number of them have unfortunately passed away due to severe illnesses. Why did your compassion exclusively apply to this specific family? And why did this overwhelming charity occur precisely after your daughter had you escorted out of her hospital by security? That is quite a miraculous coincidence, wouldn't you agree? A relentless barrage of precision strikes slammed into Richard. He stammered, sweating profusely. Harper did not give him a millimeter of breathing room. I'll ask you another question. The cigar lounge where you orchestrated this charity is located in a highly exclusive, discreet location, miles away from both your home and Mr. Miller's home. Why did you require such extreme secrecy to discuss an act of pure compassion? Were you terrified that too many people would witness your saintly behavior? Richard's psychological defenses completely shattered. His answers degraded into incoherent, contradictory babbling. We just picked a random place. Next, Martha was called to the stand. The second she sat down, she activated the waterworks. Your Honor, I was wrong. I was so wrong. I just wanted Clara to help her family. I never wanted to hurt her. She is a piece of my own flesh and blood. How could a mother ever hurt her child? Harper stared at her with absolute disgust. Mrs. Higgins, since you love your daughter so profoundly, please explain to the jury why, during her 4 years of undergraduate studies, you provided her with exactly $150 a month to survive in a major city? Please explain why, when she called you crying that she was starving, you told her to stop annoying you and to go beg her rich father. And please explain why the highest upvoted anonymous comment on the Reddit thread demanding she be fired was traced by federal cyber units directly to your home IP address? Martha's theatrical sobbing was abruptly strangled, as if an invisible hand had clamped around her throat. She had no idea the plaintiff's lawyers had dug up decades-old financial records and traced anonymous IP logs. In a federal courtroom, tears are completely worthless. Only evidence speaks. Every single one of their pathetic excuses and emotional manipulations was brutally dismantled and exposed as absurdly laughable lies. What they thought would be a trial of family loyalty had transformed into the public, surgical dissection of their own sociopathy. The trial was a massacre. Every time the defense tried to struggle, they ended up stabbing themselves on another piece of Harper's evidence. Finally, it was time for closing statements. Clara, acting as the primary victim, stood up from the plaintiff's table. She walked to the center of the courtroom, completely ignoring the desperate, begging eyes of the defendants. Her gaze was fixed calmly on the judge and the jury. Her voice, amplified by the microphone, resonated with absolute clarity through the silent room. Your Honor, members of the jury, before this trial began, every single individual sitting at that defense table attempted to contact me, begging for forgiveness. They weaponized a specific word, family. They claimed that because we share DNA, I am obligated to grant them absolution. The absolute faintest, most invisible trace of a mocking smile brushed Clara's lips. But I ask this court, when I was 12 years old, tossed between two households like unwanted garbage, did any of them remember we were family? When I was navigating the subway system with a raging fever to take my exams alone, did they remember we were family? When I worked 3 grueling minimum wage jobs over a single summer just to afford my college tuition, did they remember we were family? No. At that time, in their eyes, I was nothing but an irritating, burdensome parasite that they wished would simply disappear. 10 years later, that parasite survived. I funded my own education. I became a neurosurgeon. And suddenly, I possessed utility. And so, they remembered me. They swarmed me like starving sharks smelling blood in the water. They wanted to rip away the success I spent a decade bleeding for, so they could feed it to their real families. And when I refused to be their host organism, they revealed their true, monstrous nature. They deployed the most venomous lies and the most depraved criminal tactics to destroy me. They tried to annihilate the career I built through countless sleepless nights of study. They tried to annihilate the reputation I built through thousands of terrifying hours operating on the edge of life and death. They tried to annihilate my entire existence. Clara's pacing was slow, but every single word dropped like an anvil onto the hearts of the jury. I am standing before you today not as a daughter filing a grievance against her parents. I am standing here as an independent, autonomous citizen of the United States of America, testifying against a syndicate of criminals who committed severe federal felonies against me. Blood is not a shield they can use to justify abuse. It is certainly not a get-out-of-jail-free card to evade the federal justice system. The law exists in this country for one singular reason: to protect citizens from malicious harm, regardless of whether that harm comes from a stranger on the street or from the people who happen to share your genetics. The prosecution rests. I ask this court to deliver the absolute maximum penalty under the law. Clara gave a slight, formal bow, turned on her heel, and walked back to her seat. Absolute silence reigned in the courtroom. Even the grizzled, veteran journalists were profoundly shaken by the cold, monolithic power of her statement. At the defense table, Richard and Martha were drained of all color. They finally understood the reality of their situation. They had lost. They had been utterly, catastrophically defeated. They hadn't just lost a lawsuit. They had been stripped of the very last shred of their human dignity. After a short deliberation, the judge re-entered the courtroom. His expression was grim as he read the verdict. In the matter before this court, the jury finds the defendants Richard Vance, Martha Higgins, Eleanor Vance, and Derek Higgins guilty of conspiracy to commit extortion, wire fraud, and criminal defamation. The actions of the defendants were highly premeditated, deeply malicious, and caused severe societal disruption. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that Richard Vance is sentenced to 3 years in a federal penitentiary. Martha Higgins is sentenced to 2.5 years in a federal penitentiary. Derek Higgins is sentenced to 18 months. Eleanor Vance is sentenced to 1 year of supervised probation. When the words 3 years in a federal penitentiary echoed through the room, Richard's eyes rolled back in his head and he collapsed flat onto the defense table, passing out cold. Martha unleashed a blood-curdling, demonic shriek. She thrashed like a wild animal, lunging toward Clara. "Clara, you psychotic bitch! I will haunt you from hell!" Federal marshals instantly tackled her, pinning her to the floor as she continued to spit venomous curses. Eleanor broke down into hysterical, ugly sobbing, while Derek stared straight ahead, completely catatonic, unable to process his new reality. The courtroom was in absolute chaos. Yet, in the dead center of this hurricane, Clara did not even blink. She sat there in total stillness, watching the grand finale of this grotesque theater. Then, flanked by Harper Thorne, she stood up, navigated through the screaming chaos, and walked out the heavy oak doors of the courtroom without ever looking back. The crisp afternoon sun hit her face, instantly burning away the sterile, freezing gloom of the courthouse. She pulled out her phone and checked her Cartier watch. It was 3:00 p.m. She had just enough time to beat the Manhattan traffic and make it back to the hospital for the 4:00 p.m. neurological case study conference. The brutal, agonizing war that had consumed the last few months was finally over. Her life was merely resetting to its optimal baseline. Everything was perfect. The federal verdicts dropped like a guillotine, violently severing the last remaining threads of dignity from the two families. Richard Vance woke up from his courtroom collapse in a prison infirmary, greeted by cold steel handcuffs and the agonizing reality of his new life behind bars. In the women's correctional facility, Martha Higgins's hair turned almost entirely white within a matter of days. The energy she used to use for screaming and manipulation was now reduced to paranoid, muttering, and hollow, agonizing regret. Derek spent his days in a medium-security facility, entirely stripped of his former arrogant swagger, rotting in depressive silence. Eleanor was the only one who had survived the absolute worst of the storm, having received 1 year of supervised probation. Legally, as long as she kept her head down and didn't violate the terms of her release, she wouldn't see the inside of a cell. Everyone assumed this brush with annihilation would force her to learn her lesson and disappear into the shadows. They were wrong. For a specific breed of narcissist, punishment does not trigger self-reflection. It only breeds a darker, more psychotic resentment. Eleanor returned to the massive, hollow mansion she used to share with Richard. Her husband was in federal prison. Her stepson, Julian, thoroughly ostracized and bullied at his elite prep school due to the highly publicized scandal, had become deeply depressed and reclusive. Eleanor's entire high society network had vanished overnight. The wealthy socialites who used to kiss her cheek at galas now blocked her number and crossed the street to avoid her. She was a pariah. Her life had plummeted from the penthouse to the gutter. In Eleanor's warped mind, there was only one person responsible for this apocalypse: Clara Vance. Eleanor's daily obsession became frantically Googling Clara's name. She watched Clara be officially reinstated as chief of neurosurgery, receiving a standing ovation from the hospital board. She read articles stating Clara's outpatient consultation waitlist was booked out for 2 years, her expertise treated like gold dust. She saw high-definition photos of Clara featured in top-tier medical journals, looking pristine, powerful, and radiant. Clara's universe hadn't dimmed at all. It was burning brighter than ever, while Eleanor's universe was a smoldering ash heap. Why does she get to win? A toxic, suffocating jealousy gnawed at Eleanor's sanity until she lost her grip on reality. She became a ghost, haunting the periphery of Clara's life. She would park her car blocks away from the hospital, watching Clara leave her shift and drive away. She would secretly tail Clara's Audi back to her ultra-luxury Upper East Side condominium complex. Staring up at the glowing windows of the high-rise, Eleanor imagined Clara sipping expensive wine in peace, while she was condemned to rot in an empty mansion with a traumatized stepson. The contrast drove her completely insane. One evening, Eleanor finally snapped. She ambushed Clara right outside the lobby doors of the luxury building. She had stripped away her usual designer clothes, wearing a plain, cheap coat, intentionally making her face look haggard and desperate. "Clara," she blocked the path, her voice raspy. Clara looked at her. There was zero surprise in her eyes, and zero emotion. She looked at Eleanor the same way one looks at a piece of chewing gum stuck to the sidewalk. "What do you want?" Eleanor forced a few tears from her eyes, deploying a desperate, pathetic routine. "I know you hate us. Your father. He's paying the price. But Julian is innocent." She yanked the trembling teenager out from behind her. The boy kept his head down, his eyes darting with a mix of terror and deep resentment toward Clara. "Look at him. He's being relentlessly bullied at school. He's on the verge of clinical depression. Clara, I am begging you. Your father's firm is filing for bankruptcy. Can't you just make a few phone calls? Wire some funds to keep the company afloat? If the company survives, Julian will at least have a trust fund to survive on. At the end of the day, he is still your brother. He is Richard's only son." The performance was incredibly earnest. If you didn't know better, she looked exactly like a tragic, desperate mother fighting for her child's survival. Clara listened to the entire speech in silence. Then, she smiled. "Mrs. Vance, are you suffering from a severe misunderstanding regarding Richard's company? According to public corporate filings, you have always been the primary legal representative of that LLC, and you hold the majority shareholder equity. That means the firm is legally your personal asset, not my father's. You are standing here using his son as a meat shield to beg me to bail out your personal bank account." Clara took a deliberate step forward, leaning in so close that only Eleanor could hear her whisper. "Are you treating me like an absolute idiot? Or are you just disappointed the judge only gave you probation, and you're actively trying to find a way to join my father in federal lockup?" Eleanor's entire body went rigid. The tragic, weeping mask froze on her face, instantly replaced by sheer, hyperventilating panic. She never expected Clara to possess a forensic knowledge of their corporate structure. Her pathetic, greedy little scheme had been X-rayed and brutally dismantled in 5 seconds. Clara stood up straight, returning to her normal volume. "If your son is being bullied, that is a consequence of his own actions and your spectacular failure as a parent. Whether your company goes bankrupt or burns to the ground is entirely irrelevant to me. I highly suggest you stop performing street theater and use your time to seek urgent psychiatric help. Because while you are on federal probation, if your mental instability leads you to commit a crime, the consequences will be catastrophic." Without waiting for a response, Clara bypassed the paralyzed mother and son, swiped her key fob, and walked through the glass doors of her luxury building. Eleanor stood frozen on the pavement, her blood running cold. Clara's final sentence wasn't just a warning. It was a lethal, hyper-accurate psychological profile that made the hairs on the back of Eleanor's neck stand up. But instead of snapping Eleanor back to reality, Clara's absolute, crushing indifference pushed her over the edge into total, destructive mania. She interpreted Clara's cold logic as an arrogant, sadistic mockery. "You're warning me? You think I'm scared of breaking the law? I'll show you. I'll show you exactly what a woman with nothing left to lose is capable of." A dark, deeply twisted plan crystallized in her deranged mind. "If I can't destroy your career, I will destroy your sanctuary. I will turn your pristine, luxury penthouse into a repulsive, biohazardous landfill. I want you to open your door every morning and choke on the stench of rotting garbage. I want your elite, snobby neighbors to look at you like you're a diseased rat." The thought of it gave her a sick, euphoric rush. She immediately began gathering supplies. She went to the industrial dumpsters behind fish markets, scavenging rotting fish guts and liquefied vegetables. She drove to a junkyard, collecting bags of foul, grease-soaked trash. She even sneaked into a public park restroom with a bucket, scooping out human waste. She loaded all these biohazards into the trunk of her luxury SUV, the same vehicle that used to chauffeur her to Hampton's charity galas, now functioning as a mobile septic tank. On a moonless night, Eleanor drove back to Clara's Upper East Side building. Wearing a black hoodie, a mask, and sunglasses, she looked like a deranged burglar. Avoiding the main lobby cameras, she slipped through an unsecured side gate near the loading dock. Since the elevators required a resident keycard, she hauled her buckets of filth up the concrete stairwell, climbing story after story. Clara lived on the 17th floor. By the time Eleanor reached the top, gasping for air and sweating profusely, her psychotic hatred had reached its absolute zenith. She stared at Clara's pristine, custom-finished mahogany front door, a grotesque, manic grin stretching across her face under her mask. She unleashed her arsenal. She dumped the rotting fish guts and liquefied garbage in a massive pile directly against the doorframe. She pulled out a bucket of industrial red paint, splashing it wildly across the pristine white hallway walls, scrawling massive, deranged words. Sociopath, monster, rot in hell. For the grand finale, she unscrewed the lid of the bucket filled with human waste, laughing maniacally as she hurled the sludge directly onto Clara's door and the expensive welcome mat. Instantly, the enclosed hallway was consumed by a suffocating, eye-watering, apocalyptic stench. Her mission accomplished, Eleanor abandoned the empty buckets, sprinted back down the 17 flights of stairs, slipped out the service exit, and sped off into the night in her SUV. She felt an overwhelming surge of adrenaline and victory. She gleefully hallucinated what would happen the next morning. Clara opening her door, screaming in shock, vomiting from the smell, while her wealthy neighbors peeked out of their doors, judging her in disgust. She finally felt like she had drawn blood. The next morning at 6:00 a.m., Clara woke up to her alarm, went through her meticulous morning routine, and prepared to leave for the hospital. The moment she opened her front door, a physical wall of putrid stench hit her face, causing her to instinctively pull back. She looked down at the biohazardous war zone covering her threshold, and then at the psychotic red graffiti smeared across the hallway walls. Her face did not display a single micro-expression of what Eleanor had desperately fantasized about. There was no fury. There was no shock. There wasn't even a flicker of disgust. She merely pulled out her smartphone with surgical calm. First, she meticulously photographed the scene from multiple angles, ensuring the lighting captured the full extent of the vandalism. Then, she made 3 phone calls. The first was to the building's concierge. "Good morning. This is Clara Vance, Penthouse 17A. My front entrance has been maliciously vandalized with biohazardous waste and industrial paint. Please dispatch a hazardous cleanup crew to my floor immediately. Furthermore, please isolate and back up all security footage from the loading dock, stairwells, and perimeter cameras between midnight and 6:00 a.m. The NYPD will be arriving shortly to collect it." The second call was to Harper Thorne. "Harper, good morning. It appears my stepmother Eleanor did not appreciate my recent legal advice. She turned my front hallway into a rather repulsive performance art exhibit last night. I have documented the evidence. Please draft an emergency motion to the federal judge requesting the immediate revocation of her probation. I believe felony vandalism and bioterrorism heavily violate the terms of her supervised release." The third call was to 911. "NYPD dispatch. What is your emergency? I am reporting a felony destruction of property and trespassing. The location is. The primary suspect is my stepmother, Eleanor Vance. She is currently serving a federal probation sentence, which she has just violated." Hanging up the phone, Clara stepped back inside her apartment, swapped her designer heels for a pair of disposable surgical booties she kept in her bag, and carefully stepped over the perimeter of the filth. She removed the booties, dropped them in the trash chute, pressed the elevator button, and headed to her Audi. She drove to the hospital exactly as she did every single day, as if the disgusting battlefield behind her simply did not exist. She knew a fundamental truth. When someone is actively digging their own grave, you don't jump in to stop them. You simply stand back, watch them dig, and politely call the hearse to pick them up. Or in this case, the prison transport bus. The efficiency of an ultra-luxury building's management and the NYPD was exceptional. By the time Clara was scrubbing in for her first craniotomy of the day, the biohazard had been completely sanitized, and the ruined wallpaper temporarily covered with clean white panels. Meanwhile, detectives quickly zeroed in on the suspect using the perimeter cameras. Even though Eleanor wore a mask, the license plate of her luxury SUV was captured in 4K resolution by the alleyway camera. The police drove directly to Eleanor's mansion and dragged her out of bed in handcuffs while she was still dreaming about her glorious revenge. Sitting in the precinct interrogation room, presented with the HD camera footage, Eleanor initially tried to play dumb, but when the detective casually mentioned that Dr. Vance's lawyer had already filed a motion to revoke her federal probation and was pressing felony destruction of property charges, Eleanor's psychological reality snapped. She thought this was a petty, high school-level prank, a screaming match, maybe a small fine for the cleaning bill. She never, in her wildest, most deranged dreams, anticipated Clara escalating a pile of garbage straight to a federal judge. She had completely forgotten about the invisible sword of supervised release hanging directly over her neck. Committing a new crime while on probation triggered an automatic, non-negotiable revocation. She was going straight to a prison cell. Eleanor broke down into agonizing, guttural shrieks in the interrogation room. She cursed Clara for being a heartless monster who wouldn't leave her a single path to survive. She begged the detectives, claiming it was just a moment of temporary insanity. But it was entirely too late. She had sprinted past the legal point of no return. She had personally loaded the gun and handed it to the executioner. Because the evidence was absolute, the legal process moved at lightning speed. Eleanor was found guilty of felony destruction of property. The judge's ruling was merciless. For the crime of felony destruction of property, the defendant is sentenced to 6 months. Furthermore, due to violating the conditions of her supervised release, the original suspended sentence of 12 months is hereby activated. The sentences will be served consecutively. The defendant is remanded to federal custody for a total of 18 months. When the judge slammed the gavel, Eleanor's eyes rolled back, and she collapsed entirely in the defendant's chair. 18 months. She couldn't escape the cage after all, and she had put herself inside it in the most humiliating, idiotic way imaginable. This event served as the final, apocalyptic blow to Julian. With his father in prison, his mother in prison, and the family assets frozen or bankrupt, the pampered, elite prep school boy lost everything overnight. He never returned to his Manhattan school. He was quietly sent away to live with Eleanor's distant relatives in a rural, impoverished town, disappearing from New York City forever. As for Clara's grandparents, after the sentencing, they attempted to use a proxy to demand elderly alimony from Clara. Their logic was that since their children were in prison, they had no one to support them, and Clara, as their granddaughter, had a legal obligation to pay for their nursing home. Clara's response consisted of a single, legally bulletproof paragraph delivered via Harper Thorne. Under relevant state statutes, a grandchild may have a filial responsibility to support a grandparent only under highly specific circumstances, namely if the biological parents are deceased or medically incapacitated. Your children are merely incarcerated, not deceased, and they still possess seizable assets. I advise you to file a civil suit against your own children in prison to liquidate their remaining assets for your care. I trust the legal system will grant you a fair judgment. The response was an impenetrable fortress of logic, choking the two parasitic grandparents into absolute silence. At long last, every single leech that had attempted to suck the lifeblood from Clara Vance had been surgically, permanently excised from her existence. Not just with the precision of a scalpel, but with the ruthless, absolute power of the law. Her universe finally achieved a state of profound, total purification. That evening, Clara did not take an extra on-call shift. She stopped by a high-end florist and purchased a massive, vibrant bouquet of sunflowers. Returning to her penthouse, she arranged the flowers, a symbol of fierce, unyielding light, in a crystal vase in the center of her living room. She poured herself a glass of vintage Pinot Noir and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the Manhattan skyline was a sprawling, glittering ocean of light, as brilliant as a galaxy of stars. And she had finally become a sovereign, fiercely independent, and blindingly bright star within it. She raised her glass to the reflection in the window, her voice barely above a whisper. To a new life. 2 years later. Early summer. Dr. Clara Vance was now one of the most untouchable, revered names in American neurosurgery. She had been promoted to chief of the entire Neurological Institute and had founded a state-of-the-art brain mapping research center bearing her name. Her life was compartmentalized into hyper-efficient, minute-by-minute blocks, complex surgeries, VIP consults, clinical trials, international keynote speeches, and mentoring elite surgical residents. It was exhausting, but it was flawless. This was the absolute, orderly empire she had built with her own 2 hands. One afternoon, a letter arrived at her office. It had no return name, only the stamp of a state women's correctional facility and a string of inmate identification numbers in the corner. Clara's clinical assistant, a sharp, recently graduated young woman, hesitated before handing it over. Dr. Vance, do you want to look at this? The assistant was well aware of Clara's history. The legendary, nuclear-level lawsuit was basically required reading for any new hire in the department. Clara looked up from a massive stack of English medical journals. Her eyes were placid. Leave it on the desk. She didn't open it immediately. It wasn't until her lunch break, when she was completely alone in her office, that she casually picked up a silver letter opener and sliced through the cheap paper. The stationery was standard-issue prison paper, thin and brittle. The handwriting was erratic, shaky, and covered in crossed-out words. It was Martha's handwriting. Clara only scanned the first line. "Clara, my sweet baby, Mommy is in here, and I think about you every single day." Clara's brow didn't twitch. She didn't even have the morbid curiosity to read the rest. She could predict every word. The fake repentance, the manipulative nostalgia, the whining about prison food, the desperate attempt to use severed biological ties to extract a microscopic drop of pity. Unfortunately for them, Clara was a surgeon. She knew that once necrotic, cancerous tissue is excised. Its only possible destination is the biohazard incinerator. You do not pick the tumor out of the trash and sew it back into your body. Clara picked up the letter. She didn't dramatically rip it to pieces or throw it in the wastebasket. She simply placed it, perfectly flat, alongside a stack of expired medical supply catalogs, and fed it directly into her heavy-duty paper shredder. Whirr. The mechanical grinding of the machine was monotonous and incredibly soothing. Watching those pages, heavy with toxic, fabricated emotions, get obliterated into meaningless confetti, the absolute faintest, almost imperceptible smile ghosted across Clara's lips. This was their only appropriate ending. Having disposed of the trash, she unscrewed her Yeti mug, took a sip of hot lemon water, and returned to analyzing the afternoon's MRI scans, as if the prison letter had genuinely just been another piece of junk mail. A few hours later, her assistant knocked on the door. "Dr. Vance, the director from the Underprivileged Pre-Med Scholarship Fund is here to see you. They're waiting in the conference room." Clara nodded. "Tell them I will be right there." Using a significant portion of her clinical bonuses and patent royalties, Clara had established a private endowment. The fund was dedicated exclusively to financing the medical school tuitions of brilliant, severely underprivileged students who came from broken or abusive homes. She named the fund the Cornerstone Initiative. The philosophy was simple. If you don't have anyone to lean on, you become your own cornerstone, and you pull yourself out of the abyss. Clara never viewed herself as a savior. She was merely using her vast resources to hand a small, titanium pickaxe to the young, desperate kids climbing the exact same dark, jagged cliff face she had climbed. Whether they made it to the top was entirely up to their own grit, just like it had been for her. 5 minutes later, she closed the patient file, stood up, and walked out of the office. In the corner, the shredded remnants of her past lay silently in the plastic bin. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting warm, geometric shadows across the pristine floor. Everything was exactly as it should be. Among the surgical residents Clara mentored was a young woman named Chloe Sparks. Chloe wasn't the most naturally gifted resident in the cohort, but she possessed an almost terrifying, grinding work ethic and a refusal to ever surrender. She reminded Clara entirely of her younger self. Because of this, Clara paid a microscopic level of attention to Chloe, attention that manifested as utterly merciless, borderline dictatorial standards. When Chloe made a minor decimal error in a clinical research dosage report, Clara rejected it and forced her to rewrite the entire 50-page document 3 times from scratch. When Chloe hesitated for a fraction of a second while holding bipolar forceps during a live craniotomy, Clara kept her in the scrub room for 30 minutes post-op, delivering a brutally surgical critique of her psychological weakness. The entire department watched in quiet horror, convinced the legendary Ice Queen was going to drive the poor resident to a nervous breakdown. Chloe herself spiraled into deep imposter syndrome, secretly crying in the on-call room locker on several occasions. But after every breakdown, she would wipe her face, turn on her desk lamp, and brutally drill every single flaw Clara had exposed. She eventually realized that Clara's supposed cruelty was actually a laser-guided missile, targeting weaknesses Chloe didn't even know she possessed. Every harsh critique was a scalpel, cutting away her academic arrogance and fatal hesitations. She began to understand that this was an elite, bloodless form of profound mentorship. 6 months later, Chloe became the first author of a groundbreaking paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine. The corresponding author listed at the bottom was Dr. Clara Vance. The day the issue dropped, the entire neurosurgery wing celebrated. Clutching a physical copy of the journal, her face flushed red and her eyes welling with tears, Chloe burst into Clara's office. Dr. Vance, thank you. She grasped Clara's hand with both of hers, trembling. Clara was head down, typing an operative note. She didn't look up, merely offering a flat, Why are you crying? Use that adrenaline to outline the hypothesis for your next clinical trial. Your career is barely in its infancy. Chloe nodded furiously, swallowing her tears. She knew she would never, ever hear a warm, "Great job, sweetie," from this woman. But what Clara gave her was infinitely more valuable than cheap, hollow praise. That weekend, Chloe's parents drove 8 hours from their rural farming town in Ohio to New York City. The two weathered, elderly farmers brought massive coolers full of homegrown vegetables and dozens of fresh farm eggs. They desperately wanted to take Clara out to dinner to thank her for changing their daughter's life. Clara politely declined the dinner invitation, but she accepted the vegetables and eggs, instructing her assistant to distribute them among the nurses on the night shift. Before leaving the hospital lobby, Chloe's mother, a rugged woman with calloused hands, grabbed Clara's arm. Speaking in a thick Midwestern accent, she said, "Dr. Vance, our Chloe has always been a stubborn mule. Thank the Lord you were hard on her and molded her right. My husband and I ain't got much schooling, and we ain't good with fancy words." She stepped back, and the two elderly parents moved forward, preparing to pull Clara into a deeply emotional, tearful embrace. Clara immediately reached out, her strong hands firmly catching their shoulders, politely preventing the embrace. Her face remained composed, but her voice lost a fraction of its usual Arctic chill, softening into something genuinely respectful. "Mr. and Mrs. Sparks, you do not need to thank me. You raised an extraordinary daughter. Her success is built on her own relentless grit and the foundation you provided her. You should be immensely proud of her." She glanced at Chloe, who was standing to the side, overwhelmed and awkward. Clara looked back at the parents. "Have Chloe take you to a premium steakhouse in Manhattan tonight. Put the entire bill on my corporate card." With that, she turned and walked back toward the elevators. Chloe and her parents stood frozen in the lobby. After a long moment, her mother whispered nervously, "Chloe, honey, does Dr. Vance hate us?" Chloe shook her head, a massive smile breaking across her face as tears freely spilled down her cheeks. "No, Mom, Dr. Vance. She's the best person in the entire world." Upstairs in her office, Clara stood by the window, looking down at the street. She watched Chloe hook her arms through her parents' elbows, the three of them laughing and walking down the New York sidewalk together. Her gaze was distant, quiet. She remembered a girl from a lifetime ago, crying into a payphone about having no money for food, and the impatient voice on the other end snapping, "Stop annoying me." It turns out that the bond between parents and children isn't always a transactional, parasitic nightmare. Sometimes it is this, clumsy, unpolished, yet overflowing with an unyielding, unconditional love. It's beautiful, Clara thought. Even though she never had it, she had finally witnessed it. And that was enough. 5 years later. At 42, Dr. Clara Vance was the youngest vice president of medical affairs in the 100-year history of Manhattan Pinnacle Hospital, overseeing all clinical quality and surgical education. She no longer had to scrub in every single day, but every complex, near-impossible neurological case in the state eventually landed on her mahogany desk. Her decisions dictated life and death, joy and devastation. She was busier than ever, yet she radiated an impenetrable, absolute calm. Time had not aged her. It had only sharpened her into a terrifyingly authoritative force of nature. That spring, she was invited as the keynote commencement speaker at her Ivy League medical school alma mater. Standing behind the heavy wooden podium, she looked out at the sea of thousands of young, brilliant minds, their eyes wide, uncorrupted, and burning with ambition and fear. She didn't bring a script. She gripped the edges of the podium and spoke, her voice echoing across the grand university quad. "Good afternoon, class of 2026. I am not here today to shower you with platitudes about a bright future. I am not here to tell you that the world is your oyster. I want to talk to you about a blade." A nervous, polite chuckle rippled through the graduating class. Clara's expression remained dead serious. "The scalpel you will hold in your hands for the next 30 years is a piece of cold, unfeeling steel. When you take it in your hand, you cannot look at a patient and see their wealth, their status, or their social connections. You cannot allow your brain to be clouded by hesitation, cowardice, or misplaced pity. You must see only one thing: the pathology. Your singular, divine mission is to find the tumor and excise it using the most precise, ruthless, and absolute method possible, because your ultimate duty is to save the host organism." To achieve this, we sometimes have to sacrifice healthy tissue. We are forced to make decisions that look incredibly cold-blooded to the outside world. That is the burden of a surgeon. It is our greatest calling, and it is our heaviest curse. Her voice reverberated across the quad, carrying a metallic, chilling weight. In your own lives outside the OR, you will also encounter pathologies. They will manifest as toxic habits, parasitic relationships, and environments designed to drag you down and bleed you dry. They will consume your energy, rot your potential, and render you weak and miserable. When you encounter these malignant forces in your personal life, I pray that you act exactly as you would in the operating room. Diagnose the toxicity with cold logic. Pick up the blade and cut it out without a single second of hesitation. I promise you, the amputation will hurt. You will bleed. But believe me when I say, radical resection is the only cure for a malignant tumor. Only after you have excised the rot can you heal. Only then can you build a genuinely powerful, sovereign life that cannot be consumed by anyone or anything. Congratulations, doctors. Thank you. She gave a curt nod. The quad was dead silent for 3 agonizing seconds before erupting into a roaring, thunderous standing ovation that shook the campus trees. After the ceremony, Clara politely declined the dean's invitation to the VIP gala dinner. She drove her Audi alone back to Manhattan, returning to her pristine, silent penthouse. The apartment was immaculate. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows framed the electric, pulsing grid of New York City, a million lights glowing like liquid gold. She opened a bottle of vintage Burgundy. She didn't turn on any music or the television. She simply held her crystal glass and stood by the glass, looking out over the city. It had been years since she last thought about Richard, Martha, or any of them. They were like a microscopic, benign tumor she had excised a decade ago. She knew they had once existed in her body, but she had long forgotten their shape, their location, and the pain they used to cause. The memory was completely neutralized. She occasionally received emails from Dr. Chloe Sparks, who was now a formidable attending surgeon in her own right. The kids she sponsored through the Cornerstone Initiative routinely mailed her their straight-A transcripts and heartfelt letters. Her universe was no longer empty, but the people who occupied it were individuals she had meticulously vetted, chosen, and permitted to enter. She was the absolute architect of her own existence, and she had built an indestructible, fortified empire of the mind. Clara looked out at the endless sea of city lights, gently swirling the dark red wine in her glass. This blinding, beautiful skyline was the territory she had conquered through years of blood, sweat, and absolute ruthlessness. And now, it was her kingdom, peaceful, eternal, and entirely her own.